So back when I was growing up, I had a bunch of unsavory shite happen to me and ended up being placed in a foster home. Well, technically it was more of a holding cell for kids to live until they found a real home. Because I was a hurt and untrusting kid at that point, I cycled through my fair share of different families. I remember staying with an obese single man who I don't really remember much about, but I do remember very bad vibes while staying at his house. My case manager must have thought so too, because I was moved to a different home shortly after. That's when I met the family, more specifically the son of a bitch that this story is about. This wouldn't be my last foster home, and I didn't live there long at all, so some things have gotten foggy over the years. I think I was around 8 to 10 years old maybe. It was a real full house with 6 of us in total. My foster mother and father, 2 brothers and a sister. The only person I did not like straight out the gate was my sister. You know that feeling where you just know when someone wants you off this earth? For me, it feels especially raw when it seems unjustified. Like, I know I was technically a foreign invader, a cancer cell in their home or whatever, but guess what? I was a mouthy brat too, and gave her attitude right back. It goes without saying that she and I never got along much. The brothers, on the other hand, well, I loved them. We did everything together, and they made me feel like a part of the family, which is what made what they did to me next so confusing. So far, the only slightly unusual thing about this family was they had this strange intercom system in their home. Mostly, the mother would use it to tell us to go to sleep after hours. A few months go by and summer rolls around. They had been pumping me up about swimming in the pool in the backyard for a while. The only thing was, because I didn't have a lot of normalcy, I didn't even remotely know how to swim, and I was terrified of the open water. On the day this happened, my brothers and I were all out by the pool. They also had a slide they used for the pool area. It went straight into the deep end. Looking back on it, the entire afternoon was basically a setup, like the whole family planned this together. They kept pressuring me to use the slide, and said that they would help me if I couldn't swim to the sides. I really wanted to be like them, free to do things without worrying about the consequences, and I really believed they wouldn't let me drown. I mean, we were supposed to be a family, right? Okay, so I slide down the pool. Seconds later, I'm starting to drown. I don't know which way is up, and I'm fighting for air, something to grab, anything. It seemed like it was going on for way too long. Suddenly, my adoptive father had me barely above the water, holding me up with one hand. If at gunpoint I had to describe his face in that moment, I'd say it was a mix of lust and contempt. It was really blurry and happened fast, but faces like that are hard to forget. "I could let you drown right now, boy." That's what he said to me, those exact words. I don't think he'd ever referred to me as boy at all before that point. I was crying and gasping for air, but he just held me there, with my head only inches above the water. And for what? I still don't understand why. It was one of the 3 or 4 times in my life I truly believed I was going to die. Eventually, after letting me continue to drown, he walked over to the edge of the pool and set me upon it. Right then, I was so terrified of him, I didn't know what to do. I just laid there once I climbed up, and didn't want to be near anyone in that home. I remember one of the strangest things about that experience was the aftermath. We went to a Mexican restaurant that night, and they all acted as though nothing had happened. I was confused, angry, and scared. Maybe it was insignificant to them. Maybe it was not an abnormal thing to them, or perhaps he'd done it to teach me a lesson or something. Well, anyways, fuck that and fuck that family too. Soon after, I updated my case manager on the incident, and I was out of that house within days if I recall. All you people with both parents, try to make things right with them if they aren't. Always appreciate your family, because I don't have any. Anyways, I just wanted to share some of my life with you all. Thanks for listening. This is a true story of something I experienced. It must have been over a decade by now. I was a kid at the time my dad bought this quaint house on the outskirts of a little town. It was a decently sized home with a big backyard, overlooking the marshes and unused farmers' fields. The only entrance to it was either through the house or across the large fields themselves. To put into context how this fits into the story, it was because my bedroom at the time was situated at the back of the house, facing that big backyard directly. I remember one night very vividly, even some 10 to 12 years later. I was sitting in my room doing digital artwork on my computer. It was something I loved to do as a teenager. I'd usually do it while listening to music with my headphones on. The way I was sitting had me facing away from the big window in my room, the largest in the entire house really. I had my blackout blinds drawn, and it was the only room in the entire house that had the light on. I'd assume from the outside you'd be able to see the slivers of light through the edges of the folding blinds. It was between 2:30 and 3 a.m. or so. I was peacefully minding my own business when suddenly I heard a massive slam against my window. It was a dull, loud thud, and then I heard what I thought was a shout. My dad was peacefully sleeping in the room next to me. How he didn't hear anything at the time still amazes me to this day. I remember just sitting there, confused, shaken, and with no clue of what I just heard. That was until it happened again. I heard it loud and clear. Somebody was outside my window in the backyard. Whoever this was had no reason to be there. I remember feeling so scared to open my blinds. Instead, I stood up and just stared at the window, not taking my eyes off it. Something I'm thankful for to this day is that I decided to go with my gut feeling in that moment. My gut was telling me to grab a flashlight and quickly check the front door. It was an old house. I would have to leave the inner comforts of the home to enter the barn to get to the main entrance and check it. I remember shining my flashlight through the glass door. The window had a frosted film for privacy. Sure enough, I barely got the flashlight lifted 3 or 4 inches to the glass before seeing the coat of whoever was skulking out there. The real kicker though? Absolute terror set in when I realized the door was no longer locked. I managed to lock it again and run back inside. The first thing I grabbed was a bread knife. Not practical exactly, but when adrenaline and fear is coursing through your brain, you'll take the first thing you can grab. I remember trying to wake up my dad, who was passed out like a drunken sailor. We never found the man, and he did not attempt to come inside again. Had I not relocked that door or decided to check, prank or not, I dread to think of what might have happened to me that night. I've seen some stuff in my life, but people are always the ones that scare me. This story takes place around mid-2016, right in the heat of that whole killer clown trend. I don't know if trend is really the right word there, but I digress. A lot of people have stories from around this time. It was fall break of 2016. My cousin and I were both in middle school, me in 8th and him in 7th. I was staying over at his house one night during fall break. There were quite a few people in his home. Me, my cousin, his 10-year-old brother, his 3-year-old sister, 3-month-old baby brother, his dad, and his stepmom. Let me try to explain the layout of the house and yard. They lived in a rather large double-wide trailer that they'd bought and had on a flattened part of a hill. Their driveway was a rather steep gravel slope that connected to the road at the bottom of said hill. Behind the house and up the hill was nothing but woods. The nearest neighbor's home was slightly down the hill to the left, closer to the road. That was our grandparents' home. With the layout set up, let me continue onward with the story. As I said, my cousin and I were the only ones still awake. We were watching TV, probably some shitty sitcom on Nick at Night or something. We kept hearing these weird noises in the woods behind the home. Now, we could see out into the woods from the window in the living room where we were sitting, but we didn't pay much attention. It was kind of windy, plus my uncle had lots of motion lights outside the home. In the back facing the woods, the side door close to the driveway, on the slightly elevated porch that overlooked the front yard and road, so we weren't too worried about anyone or anything actually being outside. If there were, surely they would have triggered the lights already. We had heard lots of stories and watched YouTube videos around this time about the whole killer clown thing. To be honest, I didn't really believe it was real. I thought it was a bunch of people sharing prank videos to catch on a trend. Something made up just to get some clickbait views, you know. Plus, we live in a small nothing town in northeast Tennessee, where everyone and their dog owns some sort of firearm. That included my uncle, a retired veteran. We were never afraid of anyone dressing up as a clown trying out for a quick jump scare and a funny reaction video. There we were, sitting on the couch watching the TV show. The only light was the TV, and the dim light above the kitchen sink only a few feet behind us. All of a sudden, the back motion detector light came on. We didn't really think anything of it at first. The lights were on 10-minute timers. If it detected one movement, it would stay on, and turn off after 10 minutes if no other movement was detected. After 10 minutes, they went back off, so we figured it was just an animal. Not too uncommon an occurrence for them to set the lights off. After 20 minutes, I went to the bathroom down the hall. I was doing my business and washing my hands. When I was coming back out, though, I noticed the motion light on the side of the house by the side door that entered the laundry room had come on. I swore I heard what sounded like footsteps on the gravel outside. Then the doorknob started rattling quickly, like someone was trying to open it. I ran into the living room and got back on my spot on the couch. Luckily, the blinds were shut, so whoever that was didn't see me. I knew my cousin had already heard the same thing I did, because he was already up and halfway to his dad's room to wake him up. At that point, I saw the light from the front porch come on. I got up to look out the window and looked out onto the porch. By this point, my uncle had his pistol and flashlight and was out on the front porch looking for whoever or whatever this was. My cousin and I were behind him on the porch watching. He looked around with the flashlight for a bit when he finally saw it. There, at the bottom of the hill, hiding in the ditch by the road, was a clown in a crappy costume. He just looked at us and waved. My uncle fired a warning shot at him, and the clown ran across the road and into the woods. My cousin and I didn't sleep anymore that night. My uncle stayed out on the porch for a few more hours to make sure no skulking clowns came back. I remember him telling us not long after the shot was fired, he heard what sounded like an ATV starting up and driving away. Troublesome kids were always and still are an issue in that area. There were houses somewhat close to each other, but far enough away that you couldn't directly see them. The only house we could see was our grandparents' house. I don't doubt it was probably some high school kid playing a prank and trying to scare whoever the house's occupants were. Years after reading some more experience with these clowns and of people's lives actually being threatened, though, it scares me to think of what he would have tried to do if he was actually able to get into the home. Good morning, all. So, to start, this happened when I was 18, and I'm currently 33. I grew up in a rural area of Kentucky, and lived right next door to the senator, actually, who had bought our neighborhood when it was just old farmland and woods. She was quite old at the time, and is still alive today as well. She bought this land back in the 70s before she was even a senator at all. She had a lot of money from her parents, I guess. There was a little backstory to understand why and how I lived right next to her. When I was 18, my yard backed up to the senator's house. I worked her farmland and did chores for her, just to make some extra cash during the summer. The senator had massive amounts of land still that backed up into unused public land that went on for miles and miles, mainly tiny streams, fields, trees, nothing too exciting really. It was next to a small highway that we had to cross to get to the next part of the wood lines. My friend, who we'll call Auntie, also did the chores and land work. He had a little brother who we'll call Willie. He was about 15. We all grew up in an area that was pretty safe, so our parents let us do whatever we wanted and just told us to be back at a decent time. We often explored these lands during the day to see how far we could go, or even if we could find anything in the woods that would be cool to explore. Of course, usually we didn't find anything. Just some makeshift campsites for what we assumed was hunting or people camping in the wilderness. One day, we went pretty close to dusk, and we happened to bring flashlights just in case it got too dark. This was during the fall of 2008. The leaves were falling and coating the ground pretty thickly. As we were walking, I started to notice we had been going in a bit of a circle. I assumed we were lost, and we could no longer hear the highway that was nearby to us. The sun was going down pretty quickly, and we only had about an hour left of light. Eventually, it got completely dark, and we started walking around in the woods with our flashlights. It quickly got darker and darker, and it was at around 10 p.m. when we knew we were lost without hope. Before anyone asked why we didn't call with our cell phones, I grew up a relatively modest life, and my parents had only given me a flip phone, which didn't have very good service in this area. Throughout the night, we were doing our best to find the way back to where we came, but it was near impossible in these dark, very thick woods. My dad had always told me that when you're out in the woods, if it ever becomes extremely quiet at any point, that means there's a much larger predator in the area. Now, mind you, we were technically in the Appalachia area, and we'd all heard the stories of what not to do while in the woods, especially at night. Auntie, Willie, and I were walking, when suddenly everything in the area got eerily quiet, all except for one noise that appeared to be someone whistling. We all stopped dead in our tracks and began to look around in every direction. We wanted to verify where this sound was coming from. I think kind of unknowingly, Auntie whistled back. We all knew you were not supposed to whistle back in the woods, especially at night, in the Appalachian regions of the world. I hit him with the back of my hand. "Why would you do that?" The whistling started to grow louder and louder, so I told everyone to start running. As we were running, the whistling got softer and softer, and eventually it faded away altogether. If we weren't lost before though, well, we sure as hell were now. As we wandered around completely lost, it was now around midnight. There was a full moon lighting the area somewhat well. We happened to walk up on a shanty, an old run-down shack. It looked like it still had somewhat of a door on it. Through the door, we could see a small fire going. As any dumb person would, we opened the door and asked if anyone was around. At that moment, we all heard leaves crunching. We turned around at once, only to see nothing there. It was as if we were in a horror movie. The whistling started again, and it sounded like it was right next to us. We all turned towards the sound, and there she was, a woman in torn-up clothing and a really shoddy appearance, about 5 feet from us. We shifted back some and looked at her with the flashlights pointing at her. "Hello?" we said. As if something about that simple question made her lose her mind, she began screaming. It wasn't normal screaming either. It was a primal, animalistic yell. She lunged at Auntie. Out of reaction, he swung his flashlight directly at the lady's face, and she fell to the ground. We all started to run because we were terrified. She jumped up immediately and began to chase after us, still screaming all the while. I assume this lady had to be on some serious drugs because she was running extremely fast and the pain did nothing to her at all. We were hauling ass through the woods for at least 15 minutes. She was still chasing us. We eventually did lose her, or so we thought. We took a break behind some bushes before we started to hear the whistling again. We sat there for at least an hour before we worked up the courage to keep running. As soon as we started, we could hear someone close to us start running as well. No longer did we hear the whistling, but we heard the steps chasing after us clear as day. We started to hear the highway again eventually, and finally found our way back. Assuming the woman was still chasing us, we got as close as we could to the highway and flagged someone down. We were terrified she was waiting in the wood line. We were frantically trying to wave people down, but no one stopped. Finally, someone did stop and let us in. He was pretty spooked because our faces were extremely pale, and he asked us what happened. We explained, and he told us a lot of homeless and mentally incompetent people live out in those woods. He took us home soon after, and we never entered that place again. That was the day I shit my pants running. A little backstory. So, I was a security guard for this local company in my area. I was assigned to a water park with another guard who was regularly there keeping watch. He was to train me and show me around, tell me what codes open what doors and things such as that. The first thing I noticed was how quick he was to enter and leave the property. He never seemed to want to spend more than 10 minutes inside before he would already be eager to leave as soon as possible. Our first night was simple. There was nothing exciting or interesting going on, so the night was really dragging. After a few hours, I asked him if he'd ever experienced anything unusual while working there. He told me he'd had some problems with people trying to enter the property without permission, but that was really about it. He also told me he hated working there because of his encounters with those very same people. He said they really creeped him out because of how sneaky they were. He didn't really want to tell me too much. He was afraid I would leave my post, it seemed. That should have been a red flag for me, but I was too excited to let anything like that scare me. After a few more hours, our shift was over, so we clocked out and went home for the day. The next night, my boss called me to explain the security guard who was supposed to be my partner had now resigned. I was of course a little upset. Now I had to work a two-man post all by myself, with barely any knowledge of this place at all. Fast forward a few weeks now, I had started to really get the hang of the place, and created my own routine with no issues at all. No break-ins, no vandalism, nothing. It was around 2 a.m. or so, and I was outside at the front of the property, completing my rounds, when I heard a door slam from inside. I jumped in surprise from just how loud it was. As I started to walk back into the property, I continued to hear various doors opening and closing. I could feel myself getting nervous. This was my first situation I'd ever had at this place. As I walked inside and started to check the doors and complete a round to make sure there was no one on the property, I got to this corridor where there was a set of stairs that led down to a door, which I noted was wide open. I walked down the stairs to close and lock that door. I was too scared to actually take a look inside. As I turned around to head back up the stairs, though, I noticed a man dressed in all black, now standing at the top of them. I took a step back and realized I was now cornered. If he wanted to try anything, I would have nowhere to run or hide. I politely asked the man if he needed something from me. He didn't reply. I then asked him how he managed to get into the property. He didn't reply to that either. He slowly turned his head and snapped his fingers. Then, from the left side of the staircase, another man slowly crawled to his side like a dog on all fours. I turned around and kicked the door open. I ran inside and locked myself in a bathroom as I called my boss and told them what I witnessed. They sent an armed security guard to my position to complete a walkthrough to make sure it was safe. As I got the call that the area was all clear, I came out and told them everything from start to finish. I soon realized, however, that they didn't believe me, so I clocked out and went home for the night. The next morning, I received a call from my boss, explaining that they'd checked the security footage from the night before, and what they told me horrified me. Every hour when I would complete my rounds inside the property, those same two men were following me throughout the facility, as if they were stalking me, like as if it was a game to them. After that, I asked for a new position because I was too horrified to work at that water park. Now I know why my trainer didn't want to work there anymore. I was 18 years old and worked in a mall clothing store. I usually worked the night shift, which meant leaving the store between 9 or 9:30 p.m. None of us thought anything about calling out good night and walking to our cars alone. Usually, the parking lot was full of all the other workers leaving at the same time. On this particular night, I was already in a great mood. I'd had a good evening at work and was going to meet up with my boyfriend when I got home. I was smiling and just thinking to myself as I walked. I got to the curb in front of the mall exit door to check for oncoming cars before I crossed over to where I was parked. It was not that far away, maybe 10 spaces away from the front. As I glanced up to verify where my car was, though, I caught the eyes of a man just sitting there in his truck. He was wearing a cowboy hat pulled down low over his face, as though he were trying to conceal himself. He was staring intently right at me. I froze in place and felt fear like I never had until that moment. I quickly snapped out of my trance and ran as fast as I could past his truck into my car, which was only spaces away. This was before key fobs, so I needed my physical keys to unlock the door. I always made fun of scary movies when the girl runs and drops her keys trying to get in. But it really does happen that way. I was shaking so badly I just could not get the key in the door. I kept dropping the damn things. I felt like I was in a bad movie. Seconds later, I was sitting in the car shaking extremely badly. I had to sit there for a moment or two before I could drive off. The man had not chased me. He didn't leave and continued to sit there. Later in the evening, I finally managed to calm down. I felt like an idiot, thinking I'd gotten scared of someone's husband picking them up after work or something. The next day, I went back to work. Same night shift. I told everyone about what happened and how scared I'd been. I made fun of myself for being such a chicken, but made sure that someone walked out with me later that night. I stood at the door of the mall, ready to run back in if I saw anything was off, but the man was not there this time. I exhaled and my friend and I went to our cars, relieved that everything was okay. The following day at work, there was no talk of my fright from 2 nights ago. It was business as usual, really. About halfway into my shift, though, the manager suddenly walked up to me and said she needed to speak with me. She turned around and walked up to a cop that I hadn't noticed was there before. Curiously, I walked over. The manager wanted me to tell the cop about what happened that night. I felt silly telling him for some reason, because nothing technically happened. Once I'd finished telling him my story, though, he started asking me a lot of specific questions about this truck. Did I know the model, the exact color? Did I know the year? I finally said something about not wanting to get anyone in trouble. I had just freaked out a little and it was not really a big deal. The cop then explained that the night before, One of the ladies leaving for the night had been kidnapped, driven around to the back of the mall into an unlit area, and was beaten and I felt myself get lightheaded, and my vision went black for a moment. It dawned on me that I had seen that. My description of the truck matched the description of the victims. That was just the beginning. Our city now had a serial rapist, and it took them years to finally catch them. His wife was the one that actually figured out it was her husband and turned him in. It was a scary time, and women were terrified to be out alone after dark. At our mall, and I imagine the others as well, no one was allowed to leave alone anymore. The parking lot was now lit up 360, and they had security on site at all times, making sure we were all safe. We also started a chain call between the stores to let one another know if you saw anyone that made you suspicious or frightened, so everyone would be on guard. I always felt a bit guilty knowing that woman had been attacked that night. Back in the summer of 2016, I got my first job at 18 years old. I was excited about the work, but not about the commute. Without traffic, it was a 30-minute drive both ways, and I normally got off work around midnight. The last thing I wanted to do was drive half an hour to get home. During the first few weeks, I was still getting used to my new routine. One of the first things my mother told me was to keep an eye on my gas tank, and that if I ever needed more, I should leave early and stop on the way there, never on the way back. I understood her concern. I was a petite 18-year-old woman, and I looked even younger than I was. Being who I am, though, I half forgot and half ignored that advice. One night on my way home, I realized I legitimately did not have enough gas to get me to my exit. I pulled into the first station I could find, not caring about the brand or the cost of the gas. I decided to make it as quick as possible and only put in about $10 worth just to get myself out of there. The station was empty, and there were sketchy-looking people walking up and down the sidewalk. There were about 20 different angles someone could sneak up on you. I swiped my card and began pumping gas. Once I got to the $10 mark, I shut it off and printed out my receipt, thinking the worst was behind me. I was about to climb back into my car and book it home when a voice came from the tiny intercom above the pump. "Ma'am, there was a problem with your credit card payment." I paused and glanced at the guy at the counter. I felt chills spiral down my neck. He was one of those tall, gaunt, and sketchy-looking clerks, staring right out the window at me, beckoning me to come inside. I stepped back towards the gas pump and pressed the button on the intercom. "What's wrong with my card? I have the receipt and it says it went through just fine." I didn't try to hide the annoyance in my voice. I didn't like the look of this guy, or the way he sounded. "I just need you to come inside, ma'am. Your receipt is incorrect. I'm going to need to run your card in here." He replied a bit too quickly. I looked back at the guy through the window in frustration. There was no way I was going in there, where I would be all alone with him. He was staring at me wide-eyed. I stood my ground, pulled out my phone, and checked my credit card app. I held it up stupidly, as if he could see it from there. I then pressed the intercom button again. "It went through. I see it on my statement. I'm not coming in there." "Ma'am, if you attempt to leave, I'll call the police. I have your tag number, so please come inside." I shouted at him from across the parking lot. "You think they're gonna come over $10 in gas? Fuck you, I'm leaving." I walked a few steps around my car and gave him the middle finger. I was just about to walk back to the driver's side and get into the seat when I paused. He was mouthing something to me through the window. I would have ignored it, but he suddenly looked much more desperate than creepy. He kept beckoning me forward and calling out something that I couldn't hear. I must have made a weird look, because 5 seconds later he slammed a piece of paper on the window. It looked like he had written it very hastily. "Guy in your car." I turned back around and noticed that my passenger rear door was now open a tiny crack, which it definitely had not been on the drive from work. I booked it inside the station. Once I was in there, the clerk locked the door behind me and told me to get down. He had his eyes on my car and a gun in his hand. I squatted down behind the counter and watched the security cameras as a tall guy in sweatpants and a windbreaker nudged my back door open, slid out, and jogged away into the night. Needless to say, I started freaking out. Turns out the clerk had noticed the guy hanging around the side of the building on the monitors. As soon as I pulled in, he made a beeline right for my car. He crouched down and opened the door, then slid himself inside as I was swiping my card, being careful not to close the door all the way so I wouldn't hear anything. The clerk had noticed all of this on the camera and immediately called the police, who arrived a few minutes later. They searched the area and my car, but were not able to locate the man or anything that would lead back to him. That gas station clerk probably saved my life, because who knows what would have happened if I had driven off with a stranger hiding in the back seat. I think the lesson here is obvious. It's not enough to be cautious. You have to stay alert and be suspicious but not stupid. Always listen to your mom. I was living in Fort Wayne for a short time. The house I stayed in was on the outskirts of the main city, set way back on a dirt road in Farmville. The house is over 200 years old, and I would regularly freak myself out because of the age, location, and my only other roommates being 2 cats. Anyway, during one of the coldest nights in January, somewhere around -15 degrees Fahrenheit, I believe, I heard someone frantically ring my doorbell at around 2:30 to 3 a.m. I slowly approached the door to get a glimpse of my unexpected company before they realized I could see them. Suddenly, I heard them thump across the wooden wraparound deck leading up to the front door and make their way to the big glass side door. I heard moaning and groaning and someone jiggling the doorknob. By this time, I'd called the cops and was cowering in my room with my pistol drawn. During the 25 minutes it took for the cops to make their way up there to investigate, I could hear and see the shadows of people outside each window, trying each one to see if it slid open. When the cops arrived, they walked around the house and only identified one set of footprints in the snow, one set of drag marks as well. They could identify where and when the person being dragged was seated down in the snow at various entry points while the other guy was checking for a way in. I moved shortly after, not because of the attempted entry, but because Fort Wayne is a terrible place to live. I work in a small building with 3 wings. My office is located in a little back hallway of one of these. I share the office with another girl, and it's usually pretty quiet. One evening, she and I were the only ones in our wing still there, when we both heard a door loudly shut out in the hallway. Needless to say, we were both confused. Upon peeking out, though, I didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. The next 2 weeks, I was staying really late to catch up on hours so I could have a winter break. I began noticing these little noises in the hallway when I was positive no one else was in the building. It sounded like shoes sliding across the floor. This happened many times. Earlier in the evenings, it would just be me and the janitor, and she started getting really spooked out. She said she could hear doors slamming in one of the wings, even though everybody had already left. We investigated together one night to find that all of the doors were still properly locked, but in one, the kitchen light was on, even though the door was still sealed. The janitor freaked out because she knew she'd turned the light off before locking the door. I also recalled the light being on a couple of nights when I was the only one there. I started to ask around if other people in the building had experienced anything weird like that. One lady said some of her room decorations had moved around when she came back from the bathroom. There's another one that really creeps me out though. Soon after all of this, another lady said that one day she'd noticed a footprint right in the middle of her desk. To be honest, I'd rather it be paranormal stuff, because the idea that there's a person living in our office really creeps me out. I was 26 when this happened. I was working at a small-town grocery store as the early morning baker, with a shift starting at 5 a.m. There wasn't an overnight crew at the store, so I was one of the only ones who was there that early in the morning, except for the store owner, who started at the same time as me. On this particular day, I didn't have the key to the store. I'd shared it with the other baker who covered for me on my days off. I wasn't able to get the key before my shift started, as I had off the previous day. It wasn't a big deal though. I would be able to get into the store as soon as the owner arrived. I've always been a very punctual person. I would always arrive 10 to 15 minutes before my starting time. I lived 15 minutes away in another town, but I like to give myself a good 30 minutes to get there, just in case for any possible car trouble or road closures or something like that. Maybe I'd stop off and get myself a coffee, etc. If I didn't have my key, I would just sit outside the front of the store and wait for the owner to arrive and let me in. On this morning, I arrived 15 minutes early as usual. I parked, grabbed up my belongings, and started making my way toward the store. The owner never arrived early. He always arrived there exactly at 5 a.m. sharp. I expected to wait the full 15 minutes. I always brought a book with me to pass the time. I couldn't browse through social media on my phone, since there was very poor reception in this small town in the middle of nowhere. I always parked in the back far left corner of the parking lot, so it was a bit of a ways to get to the building. I was about halfway through making my way toward the store. That's when I stopped and looked behind me to the main road, where I saw a very large truck coming down it. The truck suddenly stopped dead in the middle of the road. There was no stop signs or traffic lights or anything like that, so there was no justifiable reason this truck would stop here, especially at 4:45 in the morning. I was caught off guard by the situation. I was just standing there looking at that truck. I was visible in the dark, I guess, because I was illuminated by the light nearby of a nearby lamp post. The truck immediately flew into motion and made a sharp turn into the lot towards me. That's when I started sprinting toward the store. I should pause here and give a little context about the structure of the store. It was a multi-business plaza, with the grocery store being on the far right and some other businesses to the left. There was a little walkway between them that leads behind the building, where there's an additional parking lot, a few dumpsters, and the tree line of a nearby forest beyond that. I remembered that I didn't have the key to enter the store. The truck was about halfway through the parking lot, gunning it right toward me. When I finally reached the front of the store, I kept running past the door and down the walkway that led between the buildings. As I entered the walkway, I looked back to see the truck turning around and driving toward the store, making its way around to the back of the building. While I was driving around that side, the truck was no longer visible. I quickly ducked down behind some bushes that were planted right up against a pillar. Shortly after, I heard the truck pull up behind the store and idle there for a few minutes. I stayed hidden, looking for anything I could use to defend myself just in case. I settled for holding my car keys between my fingers to use as a makeshift weapon. My mind was racing, trying to wrap my head around what was happening. trying to devise a plan to get myself out of this situation. That was when I heard a door slam. Whoever was in that truck had now gotten out. I didn't want to peek out from my hiding spot, lest I possibly give away my position. Luckily, the bush was big enough that they wouldn't be able to spot me. All I had to do was be quiet. I sat as still as I could. I heard footsteps walking toward me. I was hoping this person would assume I went into one of the businesses and would just leave. I held my breath. I was sure that at any second they would find me and do God knows what to me. At this point, I thought about my phone. I knew I didn't have good cell phone reception in this town, and I didn't think it was worth it making noise to search through my bag for it. Anyway, my hands were gripping my car keys so tight, my knuckles were turning white. My body was trembling. My legs were aching underneath me, but I didn't want to readjust in fear of making the bushes rustle. Whoever this person was, they were now walking between the buildings. They passed by the bushes I was hiding in and headed to the front. They stood there silently looking for me. They didn't say a single word. There was nothing but the sounds of their footsteps. They walked past my hiding spot again soon enough, back towards their truck. I heard the slamming of their truck door as they climbed back in. I then heard the rumble of the engine as it accelerated slowly back around to the front parking lot. I could hear the loud engine of the truck idling in front of the store. They stayed there for several minutes before peeling out of the parking lot and down the road. After the truck's engine was no longer audible, I abandoned my hiding spot and ran towards my car. I got inside and locked the doors. I turned on my car as well, just in case the truck decided to come back. I sat there and listened, waiting for the rumbling of the truck's engine to return, but thankfully it never did. This happened to me in the summer of 2008. At the time, I was 18 and staying with my mother until college started again. She had moved to this area after I started college the year before, so I didn't know the area that well. This is important for the story. My mother often traveled for work, so most days I would be on my own. Every week I would stop for a slice of pizza at the shop that was near the house. After a few weeks, an employee of the pizza shop struck up a conversation, asking questions like, do I live close? How old was I? What school did I go to? Ultimately, they even asked me out to go dancing. I don't remember how old he was exactly. Definitely older than 21, but younger than 40. I know that's a huge range, but I digress. Despite only having formally met this guy that day, I stupidly accepted because I was bored. I had been fairly sheltered my whole life. I was extremely shy and had never been asked out in such a way. I honestly thought I was rebelling in some way by agreeing to go out with him. I gushed about it to my best friend, who lived in the next county over. She was excited for me. I had already planned to visit her the following day and promised her all the juicy details. I agreed to meet the guy that night outside of the pizza shop. He'd offered to pick me up from my house, but I said no, simply because I didn't want to have to explain to my mother who he was if he ever decided to show up unannounced. At the time, I felt she asked way too many questions, but in reality, I realized she didn't ask enough. Whatever club we were supposed to be going to, he never named, but again, I was a dumb 18-year-old. I thought this guy was such a gentleman for insisting he drive me there. The second I met up with him, though, things started going south immediately. I parked my car and got out to greet him. To my surprise, he was still in his work clothes. He claimed he was just getting off work, which he didn't mention would be the case earlier when we set up the time to meet. I thought it was weird, but I still got in his car. He told me after I was already inside his car and we were a ways up the road that he needed to go home first and clean up. I was immediately on edge, but I didn't want to anger him or ruin the night before it even started. I reluctantly said okay. We got to his apartment and I hesitated to enter. He ever so gently put his hand on my back and steered me inside. He turned on the TV for me and told me to get comfortable. I said I was fine and shuffled my feet a bit, clutching my purse and looking around the room, mentally recounting the path to the exit. I was relieved when he went into his room and closed the door. I then heard the sounds of running water. I relaxed a little and sat on the couch to watch TV. Not long after that, he came out of his room. My mind has blocked out the details of this part. He was either completely naked or had a towel loosely covering his privates, but he was definitely not clothed. I thought about running away, but I didn't know where I was, and this was before Uber. He tried talking to me about something mundane, as if he wasn't standing in the buff in front of a girl he had just met that very same day. I answered but kept my eyes firmly on the TV. He finally gave up and went back into his room. He got dressed and came back out and said he was ready to go. I was just super glad to get out of there. I thought we were going dancing, and a lively atmosphere with more people around would make me feel much better. When we got to his car, though, he drove away until we came to a shopping plaza with stores and restaurants. In my head, I thought, there's no way there's a dance club here. Of course, there wasn't. When I said to him I thought we were going dancing, he said we were, but that we should try and eat first. Again, while internally screaming to get out of there, I agreed to go eat with him. Now I was even further from home, and he was my only ride back. In my mind, it was best not to anger or insult him in any way. I reasoned to myself that I would surely be okay in a restaurant anyway, because there would be many witnesses there if he tried anything. I shudder thinking about how naive I was back then. We got seated, ordered food, and then he started telling me about how I should try out the margaritas at this place. I reminded him I was only 18, but he said it was no big deal. He called over the waiter before I could say anything further and ordered a margarita for me, nothing for himself. The waiter asked me my age, and I thought this was my way out. I quickly and loudly said I was 18. The waiter frowned and looked at the guy, but he made a gesture I didn't really understand. Then the waiter turned back to me and said I was not old enough. He said that this time, though, he'd make an exception. I was shocked after the waiter walked off. The guy I was with chastised me and whispered that I should have lied about my age. I asked him if he was serious, half annoyed and half exasperated. I barely passed for 18. Nobody would believe that I was any older than that. He shrugged and I nibbled my food, bitterly cursing myself for getting into this mess, praying I would make it home alive. The margarita came out, and it was massive. I tried to get away with not drinking any, but the guy noticed and kept pushing it closer to me. I wanted to keep my wits about me, but I didn't know how he'd react if I continued to refuse. I took a few sips. Whoever had made this drink was heavy-handed, to say the least. I was a complete lightweight and was only about 110 pounds on top of that. Those few sips were enough to get me very buzzed. I had been at college for a year by this time and learned some basics about drinking. I tried to shovel in more food to soak up some of the alcohol, but as small as I was already getting full. I didn't manage to sober up at all. Thinking back, the guy was watching me like a hawk with every sip. I kept my head down and could barely look at him. My vision was getting slightly blurry now, and I remember my eyes drooped a little too. I told him I no longer wanted to go dancing, I just wanted to go home. Before I knew it, he'd settled the check and we were back out the door, back in his car. He asked me if I was drunk with a chuckle, and I told him no, not even close. I tried my best not to slur my words, but I have no idea what I looked like. I must have looked like easy prey, because at this point he made his move. The car was small and he could easily reach me. I had a lot of thoughts in those short moments. I thought about tucking and rolling out of his car. I remembered there was a knife in my own car, and I wished I'd thought to put it in my purse. I thought about calling 911. It was that thought that snapped me out of my stupor. It was like all this time I'd forgotten I had my phone. I started looking for street signs and buildings that we passed by that I might be able to relate to a dispatcher. It didn't take me long before I realized he was just driving in circles. This made me angry and scared. I thought he was taking me back to my vehicle all this time. The word kidnapping flashed in my head, and my fight or flight took over. I abandoned all politeness and asked him why we were going around in circles. He ignored my question and said we should go back to hang out at his place to sober up. He started driving faster, and I told him I wanted to go home. He tried to convince me I could do that at his place. To my horror, the car stopped and we were outside his apartment. I turned to him and sternly told him he was going to take me back to my car right now, or I was calling the police. I also told him I had a knife in my bag, and if he tried anything else, I would stab him. I was shaking all over, fighting back tears and clearly bluffing. He didn't speak or move, possibly deciding if he wanted to call my bluff or just get rid of me. He had a noticeable angry scowl on his face. He seemed to decide on the latter option and started driving again. I kept my eyes on every street sign until I recognized where we were. The car barely came to a stop when we finally got to the pizza shop. I jumped out and ran to my car. Stupid me, I didn't even have my keys out and ready. I fumbled and dropped them. I bent to pick them up and opened my door. Before I could close it though, he was right there holding it open and refusing to let go. He was far stronger than me. He said that I couldn't leave without giving him a kiss goodbye. I briefly considered just running him over, but I decided that might not be the best idea. I gave him a peck on the cheek and pushed him back at the same time, then slammed and locked my door. He actually ran over and tried to reopen it. I turned the car on, but I was still hesitating. I was buzzed, and I knew I shouldn't drive if I was drunk. If I waited though, this guy would surely try and follow me home. I was only 4 blocks away and it was past 11 a.m. I took the chance and gunned it out of there. He had not gotten back to his car yet, so I got a head start. I checked my rear view the whole way and drove around the block by the house and parked in an alley to make sure I was not followed. I pretty much spent the rest of that night crying. He had my number and started calling and texting me many times, but I didn't try to answer. The next day, I went to my friend's house and told her everything. I was distraught and scared. The calls from him continued. This was pre-smartphone days, and I had no idea how to block his number. Eventually, my friend's older sister grabbed my phone, mustered up her most intimidating voice possible, and yelled into the phone about what was going to happen to him if he didn't stop calling. The calls stopped immediately after that. I never told my mother about what happened, and I never went to the police either. I also never saw that guy again. I only ever went back to that pizza place once after that, and my friend was with me. I don't remember whose idea it was to go. Maybe I wanted to show her who the guy was. Fortunately, he was not in the front. We ordered the pizza, and I made some comment that he might try and spit in our food if he knew it was me. A rather shocked guy behind the counter asked why I would say that, and I gave him a brief rundown of what happened. He walked in the back and came back a short while later, saying we needn't worry about any of that. He assured me the guy would not bother me ever again. I grew up in a small Southern California town, known for its orange groves from days gone by. All those groves have been replaced by housing developments and shopping centers now, but there were still quite a few around when I was growing up in the 90s. My friend Johnny and I used to get into all kinds of trouble back then. We were just general miscreants, but there was one time I truly believe we almost became victims of a child predator. For anyone reading this who also grew up in the 90s, you know that was a different era. We'd be out at all times of the day, and our parents would have no idea where we were. There were a lot of kidnappings back then. I can remember multiple times I was offered candy or asked by some creep to help him go find his cat for him. I always said I'd go check with my mom, and by the time she'd get outside ready to whoop some ass, of course they'd already be gone. Anyway, Johnny and I were up to no good one day after school. We were traipsing around this orange grove that bordered his street. We started pulling these little metal dam things off the irrigation channels and tossing them wantonly. All of a sudden, we heard a sharp whistle and both looked up to see a man about 25 feet away from us, wagging his finger and going, He clearly didn't own or work in the grove, because instead of screaming at us to stop, he got a wide grin on his face from ear to ear. I can still see that face in my mind all these years later, and it still gives me the chills. Johnny and I stood there for a second watching this guy. Then we looked at each other, and Johnny looked back toward the guy and shouted to run. I looked over, and the guy was suddenly in an all-out sprint right towards us. Despite the physical exertion he was putting into his sprinting, the wide grin was still there. Johnny and I ran harder and faster than we ever had before. We made it out of the grove and back to his house before noticing the guy was no longer behind us. We quickly forgot about it because Johnny's family had just gotten a Nintendo 64, and we started playing Mario to take our minds off it. I can't remember if it was the next day or the next week, but sometime after this happened, we were with his mom getting some donuts when we saw a wanted poster with a sketch of a man that looked exactly like the guy who had chased us that day. He was wanted for trying to grab a boy outside of a school. Johnny and I looked at each other and seemingly telepathically agreed to never say a word. I don't know why we never spoke up really. Maybe because we were at that age where we'd be relentlessly bullied by homophobes because of the mere possibility we could have been grabbed. We never did speak of it again. As I'm typing this, I'm considering reaching out to him to see if he remembers and if it aligns with my memory of the incident. There were so many things that happened in my childhood in the 90s that could have easily ended with me no longer alive. Somehow, I'm still here though, and I have my own family now. I trusted no one because of incidents like that, and I always had my head on a swivel. This incident took place in the summer of 2023. Last year, I transferred with my company to take a new position in a major Midwestern city. My spouse was still working and living back in California for the next few months. I rented a studio apartment for myself in a newly renovated apartment building in a popular downtown neighborhood, at least until we could look for a place together. The apartment was quite small, but it was also just as nice. It was in a secure building with interior hallways and a nice downstairs lobby. I was one of the first tenants to move to this newly renovated building, and other new residents soon started moving in as well. A major advantage of this move was that I'd only be a couple of hours' drive from my hometown and my parents. I started my new job and everything was going pretty great. I was quite enjoying my new neighborhood, and the neighbors in the apartment building generally kept to themselves like I did. Then a new guy moved in across the hall, and everything changed. We'll call him David. David was a single man in his 60s and was very different from the college students and young professionals who lived in our building. I started noticing his erratic behavior almost immediately. I would come home from work, only to see him sitting in his car in our small parking lot, just staring off into the distance. We were having issues that summer, with smoke clouds coming over from the vast Canadian wildfires. They were leaving a light dusting of ash on our cars similar to pollen. David was convinced that someone was spraying this dust onto his car specifically and was accusing various tenants he would run into in the parking lot. He would hoard trash in his apartment and leave trash bags in the hallway, causing a foul odor. He would also randomly start yelling at himself in the hallway. After enough time, I finally had enough and complained to the leasing office. The manager was quick to dismiss my concerns, saying she'd been in his apartment and everything was completely fine. In August, my parents' 50th anniversary was coming up, and I was excited to go home and spend a weekend with them. A few days before their anniversary, my boss informed me he would be flying in to work on an important project with me that would have us working throughout the weekend. I was really disappointed and felt like I was letting my parents down. I managed to get away for a quick overnight trip in the middle of the week to go see them though, and got back before my boss was due to arrive. I drove down and spent the night with them. The next morning I checked my email as I was getting ready to head back. There was an email from my apartment manager in regard to the incident from the night before. The email was very vague, but it stated a resident had died and there would be further details coming later. My heart sank, and I immediately went pale. My mind instinctively went to my strange neighbor David. I opened up a local news app for my city, and the top story was about an active shooter in my apartment building who was killed during a SWAT team standoff the night before. Apparently, David had approached my next-door neighbor in the hallway with a gun and threatened to shoot him. The neighbor ran back into his apartment and called 911. David also called 911 and told the dispatcher that his neighbors were hacking his phone, and if the police didn't come, he was going to kill everyone in the building. The police came and tried to talk with him, but he had barricaded himself in his apartment and was heavily armed. The police and SWAT teams soon arrived, and David began firing a rifle out his window at anyone he saw in the parking lot below. All of the neighbors on my floor were trapped in their apartments with no way to escape. They had to hunker down and barricade themselves from his random gunfire. There was another building across the street with a direct line of sight into our apartment building. A police sniper took a position in that building and shot David through his window. Then they flew a drone in through it and confirmed that he was dead, still with gun in hand. Luckily, no one else had been injured. I got home later that day to find a bullet-riddled apartment building and several neighbors who didn't normally even speak to each other, hugging and crying, showing each other videos of the incident from their hiding places. I'd never felt so lucky to have been out of town. If my boss hadn't messed up all my plans, I would have still been home that night. I'm sorry that David didn't get the mental health attention he needed, but he put so many lives in danger. This is a true story. God is my witness. I'm not making it up. I'm 57 years old now, but this is a memory that never goes away and never fades. In 1986, I stopped in Topeka, Kansas, on my way back from working in Yellowstone National Park for the summer. My friend had also just graduated from high school a few years before and had moved to Topeka with his parents. I stayed there for about a week. His parents invited me to stay an extra day, though, for their family reunion before I headed back home. We drove way out into the country for this family reunion of theirs in their old beater car and spent all day with his extended family. In the late afternoon, we were making our way back in his old beater, which had a broken gas gauge, mind you. Of course, we ran out of gas. He said we were probably 6 to 7 miles from the nearest gas station, pre-cell phone era. We were trying to figure out what to do when suddenly a van with no windows pulled over out of nowhere and asked us if we needed some help. When you're young, you still think these things just miraculously happen for you. When you're older, you know better. We told him we'd run out of gas. A friendly man then offered to take us to the nearest gas station. We got into the van, only to discover there were a total of 6 men inside and no seats in the back. We were just sitting on the floor of what appeared to be a work-type beat-up older model white van, when we clearly heard the men discussing doing us harm. The driver said he knew a good place to go. The other man in the passenger seat eyeing me agreed he was in and nodded his approval. Only one man, the one sitting nearest to us, said he didn't want to be involved at all. He had a baby now and he was not cool with this, that he didn't want any part of it. The driver and passenger seat rider said something under their breaths I couldn't make out. There was an angry silence while the driver thought this over. In my mind, I could only pray for help. My mind felt like I was stuttering thoughts. Part of me was in denial, another part was in shock. Fear hadn't even managed to set in yet. Just like a jolt to the system of an unreal horror happening to someone else, because an hour ago, I had been completely safe without a care in the world. Now there was the absurd idea of someone raping me. Yes, I was acutely aware that they were going to do that and then murder us both, leaving us somewhere nobody would find us. These thoughts were flipping through my head a mile a minute. Have you ever been to Kansas? There are lots of lonely, God-forsaken, desolate roads to nowhere. If, at this point, the third guy changed his mind, or simply said just let him out first, I wouldn't be sharing this with you right now. They stopped talking to each other. They had never spoken to us at all from the moment we entered the van. My friend and I didn't speak to each other either. We barely looked at each other. We were too afraid. I could hear the clanging rattle of the van's noises and the tires on the road. I saw my friend flexing as if to warn he would fight to defend himself while they were discussing where they would take us. Everything felt surreal. All of a sudden, the guy in the back just said no, and like that, the driver pulled over. The guy in the back opened the side door and let us out, and everything ended just like that. The air somehow smelled tainted. The ground looked different, like I couldn't quite trust it. My friend looked as shaken as I felt. We had just survived a close encounter with shark-like predators, the blackest, darkest evil. I looked at the gas station in the late afternoon waning sunset just before dark. It was like a safe haven of shelter and safety. I knew that once we got into that gas station, there was no way that car would be able to pick us up again. The white van with no windows pulling away from us felt so surreal. Today, I can still see that van pulling away in my mind, a sort of mirage from a nightmare that had crossed over into my waking reality. So this happened to me in 2009. I was 22 at the time, but I'm very short and often mistaken for a young teen. I had just had a driving lesson, and while normally my instructor would drop me off in front of my home at the end of our lessons, that day he had somewhere to be straight after, and instead dropped me off at a nearby bus stop. My apartment block was about 500 meters away, at the end of a long stretch of quiet road. It was an area that was being built up at the time, so there were a lot of abandoned old houses to the left and right, and my apartment block at the very end of it. That was about it. It was rare to see cars that weren't just going straight to the apartment block, because there was really nothing else there, except for a clinic a couple of streets away. You could occasionally get someone who was lost, looking for some directions. It was around 8 p.m. and it just got dark outside. The street was barely lit, but it only took a few minutes to get from my bus stop to my house, so I didn't really think anything of it. That was until a car drove past me, but then started backing up until it was driving slowly alongside me. A woman was driving, and a man was in the passenger seat. I sort of slowed down, thinking they were going to ask me for directions to the clinic. The woman instead asked me this: "Do you live here?" Now, I was thinking they definitely wanted directions, so I stopped and said yes. "We're the police and we're going to take you home." Mind you, this was a totally normal vehicle. These people weren't in uniform or in any way looked official. I was incredulous, literally so stunned all I could say was something like, "You're taking the piss." Immediately, I'm thinking these people think I must be 10 and they're trying to abduct me. The woman was starting to get agitated and kept repeating, "You have to respect the police. Get in the car and we'll take you home." I was just so shocked. I was thinking, how dare you? Partly offended they would think someone was stupid enough to fall for this. At this point, the car was stopped and I saw the woman moving to open the door. I burst into the fastest sprint of my life while fumbling with my phone to call my mom. I was screaming before I even got to the block. "Buzz me in, I'm in danger!" My dad went out to look for them immediately after, but the car was nowhere in the area. He informed the real police, but nothing ever came of it. I've always been super creeped out by this story, and often find myself wondering what their intentions were. Did they really think someone was going to fall for that? Here we go. I was 10 years old when I met my best friend, and we were pretty much inseparable. All throughout school, we were always right by each other's side. Our last names both started with J's, so we had almost every class together as well. He was a very smart kid, an A student. As we grew up and became adults, though, we had different views on what we wanted to do with our lives. He had his first child at 18 years old, split up with the child's mom as well, so the thought of college never sat well with him. He worked a 9-to-5 trying to support himself. By the time he was 21, he'd met another woman and had a baby with her as well. This time, he was doing good, stayed with the woman, taking care of his and her other child. I was really proud of him. Then all of a sudden, though, it was like something inside of him flipped like a switch. He left that woman and moved to another part of the state. I hadn't spoken to him in 2 months after. All of a sudden, late at night, I got a phone call from his mother saying he was now in jail. I asked what had happened. She told me he'd raped a 15-year-old girl, gotten caught, and got sent to prison. He was serving 2 years behind bars, only because there were texts from this girl saying she was 18 years old. 2.5 years later, he got let out of jail. I told him he could stay with me until he got back on his feet, but he chose not to. He stayed with my mom for about a month instead. Every day, I'd try and check up on him. "Hey man, how's it going? How are you?" The answer I always got was, "I'm good, thanks for helping me out." My mom called me though and said he wanted to kill himself and had a knife in his room. I drove down there to talk him down and take the knife away. Later that night, I called him again and tried to check up on him. No answer. I called my mom, who said he was still in his room. I said to go and check. He was nowhere to be found. We both found out where he went that night though. He had walked to his ex-girlfriend's house and apparently was spying on her and her boyfriend. He walked behind the house, ripped his shirt off and shoved it in a crack of the window. He then lit the shirt on fire and walked away. He attempted to kill his own child, his ex-girlfriend, and an unrelated man for no reason. Luckily, the adults in the house were awake. They smelled the fire and got the children out safely, then called the fire department. My best friend admitted to this and has been in prison ever since. No matter how much you think you know someone, you never truly know them. So, when I was a kid, I had this whistle that was honestly pretty shit. It was super obnoxious and had this terrible but very distinctive sound. It was like the dying cries of a goose, followed by a rattling noise. It always hung off a bright orange lanyard, which I'd hook on the door handle of my front door. Every morning, I'd get up and see that awful whistle hanging right there. Now, right next to my front door was a window that didn't quite latch properly. It wasn't open all the time, but if you pushed on it for long enough, it would give way. One night, it was raining hard as hell. I woke up at 4 a.m. to the sound of banging downstairs. I assumed the wind had blown the window open, and I didn't want the carpet to get soaked. I got up and went to close it up again. Sure enough, the window was wide open. As I went to close it, though, I heard something from out the window. In the distance, I heard that whistle. As I looked, I saw it was gone. The lanyard and the whistle itself were off the handle, and someone was blowing that whistle somewhere out there in the storm. I checked the house from top to bottom, and nothing else had been stolen, just that single whistle. This story may be distressing to some viewers, so discretion is advised. This happened when I was at high school. I belonged to a basketball club and developed a huge crush on a senior at said club. We ended up getting very close and often met in private together. On a date we both had off from school, he called me up asking me if I wanted to come over and hang out. Of course, I was over the moon to be invited to his home, so I asked for his address straight away. "Actually, I'm outside your house right now. Why don't you come out and I'll take you there?" I went out there as fast as I could. Sure enough, there was a car waiting outside our family home. But there was some weird guy I had never seen before, sat with my crush in the car. I got in the car anyway, and he spun around. He said to me, "Let's go have some fun." With that, we pulled away from my home, and I wondered where the hell we were going, or what the hell we were going to do. As the car rumbled through the countryside roads, the car suddenly stopped, and my crush blurted out, "I have something to do. I'll be back as soon as I can." He left the car and left me there. Oh God, why are you leaving now? I said that in my head, but I trusted that he would be right back just as he said he would. I felt lost and confused, but I tried to just enjoy the drive as the other guy picked it back up. After a while, the car stopped, and we arrived at a house that I knew was not my crush's house. The nameplate outside was something completely different. The guy in the car then asked, "Why don't we go in and have a drink while we wait for him to come back?" I felt obliged to accept his offer, as he was friends with my crush apparently. When we went inside, though, I could tell immediately something was wrong. I was getting a very bad vibe. Loads of my new acquaintances' friends were sat around a table. It freaked me out. Why was I brought here, I wondered. The people there were being very nice to me, though. Before long, night arrived, and I had mentioned a few times my desire to go home before it got too late. No one really batted an eyelid to this request, though. I really started to worry now, so I kept stating that I wanted to go home ASAP. I got an incoming call from my mom, and one of the guys there started to go crazy at me when I excused myself to try and answer it. He snatched the phone right out of my hand. This was no longer a friendly or normal situation. The man who took my phone told me I would not be going anywhere. I judged the situation as best I could and came to the conclusion that I had been brought here by my crush to these strange men. Perhaps they were small-time yakuza or something like that. It seemed as if I would be spending the night here, possibly much longer. My heart ached, and I just wanted to see my parents again. It was a feeling I wouldn't wish on my worst enemies. Before I knew it, I was bawling my eyes out. They ushered me into another room and told me to go to sleep. I tried to think on my feet. I opened the door as quietly as I could and listened in on the men's conversation. From what I could hear, it went something like this. "We'll get a good price for her from the Koreans. The poor girl, huh? I couldn't believe I was listening to them discussing my future. After they finished talking, they came upstairs and locked my door. I got in the bed. There wasn't anything else I could really do. I'd resigned myself to my fate and come to the terms with the idea that I wouldn't see my parents or friends ever again. I tried to psychologically prepare for whatever would happen next. I saw the early light of morning, and I needed to go to the bathroom. I knocked on the door, and someone came to open it. My heart was pounding again. I don't want to have to do this, but if you try to escape or go somewhere I can't see you, then... He trailed off, but his threat was obvious. I won't try to escape, I whimpered. As I said those words, I apologized from the bottom of my heart to my parents. Life in abduction went on this way for a week, until one night I was forcibly woken from my sleep and dragged out to a car so violently by the man who'd picked me up originally. I was thrown in and the engine started. We pulled away, and I had no idea where we were headed. To the Korean side, I'd guess. It had been so hard in these last days and nights to escape reality. I couldn't even comfort myself with family memories, as it would have just been too painful. I was losing my mind. I was ready to die. I couldn't physically cry anymore. I was absent-mindedly gazing out of the passenger side window when I started to notice a million things from my neighborhood. The car then pulled to a stop right in front of my house. "Go," said the man. I got out and he pulled away into the night. He must have felt some sympathy for me, I guess, or his conscience kicked in or something. To this day, I have no idea what caused his change of heart. I was dumbstruck to be returning home safely. I went inside my family home, a place I thought only moments ago I'd never see again. My mother rushed downstairs. She must have heard me come in. She was so angry because I was young and stupid. I thought telling her about what happened to me would get me in more trouble or make her worry, so I just told her I'd been staying with a friend the whole time. She screamed at me for not getting in touch with her once during the last week. My mother still doesn't know what happened. And it's 10 years later. I went back to school after, and I couldn't find a single trace of my crush, that senior who'd gotten me into that mess in the first place. He must have ditched town before handing me over to those men. I hope he can sleep at night, but I hope he's tormented and tortured by his guilt. It was truly a terrifying event, but I'm very lucky to say I'm living well these days. I'm living happily as well. This happened last January. I had taken a week off from work following New Year's, mostly in the hopes that everyone else would be back at work by then, and I could enjoy the week without it being very busy everywhere and having to work all by myself. My plans consisted of shopping around and really just chilling at my apartment by myself. On the day this happened, I was out driving around in the snow, making my way to a few stores. I then made my way back to my apartment by 7 p.m. I went inside and cooled off, then took a seat on the couch with some snacks I'd just gotten. I was watching TV and even dozing off a little bit from the long day out from the house, when at some time around 8:30 or so, the PA system in my apartment buzzed, meaning that someone was outside and wanting me to let them into the building. I had no plans for anyone coming over, so I had no idea who it could possibly be. They buzzed my room again and again, so I got up and went to the window that faced the front of the building. I tried not to lift the blinds too much, only enough for me to peek out and see who it was at the door to the apartment building. There was a large man outside. It was still snowy out and kind of dark, but I could tell he was older, mid-40s or so. I could also tell I had never seen him before in my life. There were only 3 other people living in the complex at the time, so I was at least familiar with everyone who lived here, and he was definitely not one of them. I also figured that if he did live here or was visiting one of the other people, then surely they would let him in instead. I walked over to the PA system and muted it, then got back on the couch and continued watching TV. I really didn't put any more thought into it, and even dozed off several times in the next hour. Eventually, I shut off the TV and went to bed. By then, it had to be around 10 or so. I fell asleep just about as soon as I laid down. A few hours further into the night, my eyes shot open once I heard a thud from just outside my room. It was extremely loud, but having just woken up to it, I didn't know what it was or exactly where it came from. My heart was racing as I stared across the room at my door, listening for anything else. It was very quiet now, almost like nothing had even happened. I got out of bed and slowly moved toward the door, then leaned my ear in against it to listen to the other side. It was still quiet, nothing more than the walls creaking from the building. I turned the handle and looked out into the living room, not seeing anything out of the ordinary. The whole place was really dark, and for some reason I still felt like I needed to be very quiet and not make myself known. I left the lights off as I moved through the living room and looked down the front hallway to the door to my apartment. In that moment, I realized it was fully open. I froze, staring at the now open doorway and feeling fear run through my whole body. It almost didn't seem real. I took a few steps back, staying quiet, and made my way back toward my own room. Now, on the other side of the door, I could see a huge dent in the wood right by the knob. Once I saw that, I ran in and locked it behind me, then called 911 while hiding in the closet. I was sure that whoever it was had to be somewhere inside my apartment still, and it would only be a matter of time before they got into my room. As I waited for the police to arrive, the apartment stayed silent, however. Whoever had broken in was seemingly gone. Even the police couldn't find anything to help once they arrived. What they think happened is the intruder had tried buzzing all the other rooms as well, until one of them was nice enough to let them in. Once he was in the main stairwell, it's not really clear why he chose to go for my room specifically. Maybe they thought it was empty. What's really strange is the dent on my bedroom door, which was likely the source of the thud I'd woken up to. It was just from one single hit though, not like a real attempt at breaking the door down, but more like something someone would do out of frustration before leaving. I still live in the same apartment, and nothing else has happened. Who it was and what they wanted is still unknown. This happened to me years ago when I was a new nurse. I was in my 20s and had just started working in an old folks' home. We had a resident who I'll call Bob. I didn't have an opinion of him really. He mostly kept to himself. He really just seemed like a regular old man. He was in his 70s and had several health problems, but he seemed happy and fairly normal. One day it was just him and I had to give him his medication. He had this photo album open on his lap, and he was grinning at the photos. Now, I've always made conversation with the residents, and I'd had normal chit-chat with Bob before. I asked him if he was reminiscing about something. He looked up at me and said yes. I asked him if he missed his family, as I noticed that he never had any visitors. He kept smiling and told me that his friends were his family, and they're all gone now. Our conversation went on, and when I was about to leave, he asked if I would like to see this photo album of his. Of course, I agreed, but what Bob showed me made me feel sick. The photo album was one of those flip ones, where it's a row of plastic files you can slip a photo in so you can see several at once. The photos were all of naked women, and they were all clearly in distress as well. They were bleeding and looked like they'd been beaten up severely. Pain and humiliation was etched all over their faces. They were bound and gagged in disgusting poses. One woman in particular, it felt like she was staring right into my soul, like she was really right in front of me pleading for help. The look in their eyes is what really got under my skin. I felt sick. My blood literally ran cold. I didn't know what to say. I knew Bob couldn't exactly hurt me because he was too weak and old, but I also had this thought that if I reacted in a certain way, he'd get off on it. It was like in that moment I just realized what a sick and deeply disturbed man Bob was. He stared at my face, obviously waiting for a reaction that I did my best not to give. It felt like hours passed, but it was probably less than a minute or two. He looked away from me and back to the photos, holding the album like he was presenting a priceless artwork. He smiled at the photos and told me in a wistful voice that he used to be in a biker gang. Those women were the stock. He said that him and his friends could fuck them whenever they wanted. I must admit that in that moment I felt like knocking Bob out, but I knew I had to remain calm. Something told me he would get off on it if I started shouting at him. Instead of doing anything, I just left the room without a word. I didn't know what to do, really. I still had other medications to give out, so I finished that first. I then took a minute to myself and thought that if I was a smoker, now would be the perfect time to light one up. I was angry after Bob's revelation. Whether the story was true or not, he clearly loved hurting women to have those photos in such an album. I decided to tell a higher-up. They checked Bob's room and somehow they never found the album itself. I know 100% sure that I didn't imagine it, nor was it a dream though. I have no idea where Bob hid it or the photos, but he must have known I'd report the incident. He must have stashed them somewhere. I just don't know where. Of course, they didn't search until later the next morning at like 10 a.m., so I suppose he had plenty of time to hide them away. I continued giving Bob his meds, and he never acted differently. I was always very reserved towards him after that, though. Those photos still trouble me to this day, and I believe they'll haunt me forever. I wonder how many of those girls are missing today. Are they even alive? Was he a kidnapper or what? I just don't know. I've heard stories of gang members using women like objects and abusing them. But I don't really know much about it. It's a messed up world we live in, and I try not to think too much. Memories like this have a way of rearing their ugly head occasionally, though. I wonder why Bob even decided to show me these. Did he want to relive his past and thought showing me and making me freak out would be fun? What would have happened if I started shouting at him? These are answers I'll never have. I'll never understand how someone can be so twisted and depraved like that. At the end of the day, all I can really do is pray for the women in those photos, that they're at peace now wherever they are. I was in my senior year of high school about 10 years ago. I grew up as a sort of outcast. I wasn't bullied or anything, but I also didn't really have any friends. I didn't mind that solitary lifestyle though. I went through school, and then would come home and play video games and lose myself in digital worlds. That was my escape, so to call it. My home life wasn't what I would call bad either. It was just my dad and I loved my dad a lot. He worked so much to provide for me, and when I was young, maybe 10 or 11 years old, my mom got involved with some bad people and their hobbies, if you know what I mean. My dad didn't want to expose me to that world anymore, and we eventually moved away. It was quite messy, but it was for the best. He tried getting her help throughout the years, but she always turned it down. That was all until one day when she just went off the grid completely. It was sad, but we both moved on, and when I got older, he would have to leave for the weekend once a month for his job. I didn't really mind though. It may seem crazy to people to leave someone at that age home alone for a weekend, but my dad trusted me a lot. One specific weekend during senior year, when my dad had left for the night, I started my normal routine. My pops would leave some money behind in order to order some pizza and some soda. We never had soda in the house normally, so getting a 2-liter with the pizza was like a double treat for me. My night was beginning to play out just like every other night I was home alone. I demolished the pizza and drank most of the soda, and after a little breather on the couch, I went to my room and started playing some PlayStation. And that's how I spent most of my weekends, even if my dad was home. I would usually play Call of Duty, but Grand Theft Auto Online had just come out, so I had been spending quite a bit of time playing that. After a few hours of that, I decided to play the single-player story mode. The older I got, I seemed to play the story mode in games less, but for some reason on this night I wanted to play something with some more substance, even if it was GTA. Since I wasn't playing online anymore, I took my headphones off. As much as I game, I hate wearing headphones for long periods of time. They really hurt my ears, you know. I'd been playing for a little while when I thought I could hear something coming from downstairs. There weren't any loud or crazy noises really. It was just these sort of small vibrations and little bumps. Now, I've been home alone a ton of times, and I didn't remember ever feeling any of those vibrations or hearing any small noises like that. At the same time though, it was such a small noise that it wasn't alarming enough for me to actually freak out. It was a little after 1 in the morning. I think it's in all our subconsciouses to be a little on edge when you're home alone at that hour. Every few moments I would hear this little scuffling noise. I paused the game and tried to listen in. When I listened, I would mostly just hear more silence, maybe an occasional little bump or something. Because I was home alone, of course the quick thought of an intruder crossed my mind. I'm embarrassed to say, though, that at some point I thought to myself that ghosts could be causing this. I debated back and forth with myself about this for about 30 minutes. Finally, I paused the game and went over and sat in my computer chair to just listen in fully for a few minutes, without listening to the sound of gameplay or anything else. I noticed that the sounds were happening more regularly now, those little bumps and such. I'd initially blamed it on cracking pipes or house noises, but they started to happen more and more often. The little vibrations I could feel were now happening almost every second. It was like my dad might be downstairs, but the only thing missing was hearing his voice. The thought of my dad coming home early had crossed my mind, but he would have called me, or at least poked his head in the room to see if I was still awake. Was I just being paranoid? Was I getting myself all worked up for nothing? I decided I had to go downstairs and check it out to prove to myself that nobody was in the house. Clearly, I was just letting my imagination run away from me. I crept slowly down the upstairs hall and made my way to the top of the staircase. While I was slowly heading in that direction, the muffled sounds were getting much louder, and I started to fear the worst. I thought of calling the police. I was too anxious in that moment, though. In my mind, I was thinking to myself, what if nobody's there and I waste the police's time? When I got to the bottom of the stairs, I saw a light illuminating the dark walls coming from the other side of the house. The kitchen light was on. It's possible I'd done that myself, but I was fairly certain I had shut the light off before heading upstairs. I was practically crawling my way to the kitchen. I was moving slowly. When I was only a few feet away from the kitchen doorway, I could hear what sounded like someone rummaging through my cabinets. That was accompanied by a soft humming voice. I was half expecting to see some big, burly, scary burglar, but the voice indicated something else entirely. I peeked my head around the corner when next to the kitchen sink, I saw a very small woman. Her hair was extremely wild, flowing out in every direction. I had my phone in hand ready to call the police. The situation had me frozen in terror, but also incredible curiosity. I realized that this woman was singing Disney songs to herself. I almost fainted right there, because instinctively I knew who this person was. It was my mom. She was singing the same songs she would sing to me when I was very young. It was one of the only memories of my mother I actually had left. I couldn't move. I must have been trembling because she heard me. She turned around and a big smile lit up her face. Even though this was my mom, it was not the woman I remembered. Her teeth looked rotten, and her eyes looked like they were sunken into her face. A voice that should have been soothing was now unnerving. "There's my baby. What are you doing awake at this hour?" I didn't respond. I just stood there like a statue. She came over to me and put her dirty hands on my shoulder. "What am I going to do with you? Your father, he's always changing out cabinets. I swear that man doesn't listen." She then started to laugh. But it wasn't charming or calming. It was like she wasn't really there. She turned back around and started humming, and started going through the cabinets again. I broke out of my trance and went to my room. I locked the door and called the police. I called my dad too. My dad made sure I was in the bedroom with the door locked. He didn't give me any details, but he said there was a good chance my mother was dangerous, and I needed to be safe just in case. The cops showed up and I heard an altercation start downstairs. I could hear my mom yelling at the police to get out of her house. The police knew the situation from myself and my dad, and I heard a brief struggle, then silence for a few moments. I heard a cop shout my name and tell me it was all right for me to come downstairs. I spoke with the police for a little while as another officer drove my mother away. One officer stayed parked outside my house all night until my dad came home to help me feel safer, which I really did appreciate. He spoke with one of the officers. I could tell by reading my dad's body language that he was uncomfortable, and we were potentially fortunate to avoid something horrible happening. My mother actually had 2 knives on her when she was apprehended. One knife she must have had when she broke in, and the other knife was a sharp kitchen knife that belonged to my dad, which he'd stuck in her pocket when she was in the kitchen. She never used them, but the fact that she had them was enough to freak me out. The most terrifying part of this horrible nightmare, though, was that my mother had no idea where we lived. Well, she wasn't supposed to have any idea. We moved away, and we moved far away. My dad never told my mom where we'd moved to protect me. She'd broken into the house by breaking one of the downstairs windows and crawled in. I didn't hear it at all, so that must have been when I still had my headphones on or something. The thought of my mom just humming and walking around downstairs, potentially waiting for my dad, while I had no idea, still freaks me out to this day. It's been about 10 years now, and I've only seen my mother twice since that night. She's been in some type of institution for years now. She has no memory of that night, but in all fairness, she doesn't have much memory of anything at all. It's sad, but it's true. Every time I hear those Disney songs, I sort of freeze up. I just hope one day I can forget about the fear I felt that night and find a way to remember my mom in a more positive light. I used to have a weekly overnight babysitting job for a couple who frequently spent nights in another nearby city caring for one of their ailing parents. It was a pretty easy gig because they only had one kid who was an 8-year-old and was already pretty independent. I usually just played with him for a few hours and then got him ready for bed. Then got paid another 14 hours while I watched TV, raided their fridge, and slept on their couch. One thing I hated about the job, however, was the house. It was a somewhat modern house in the country. They had these big open windows, and the style was such that there weren't any curtains I could close. I just had to watch TV and live with the anxiety of knowing someone outside could easily watch in at me, and I would have no idea. One night, I was sitting down in the living room when I thought I heard a strange noise. I turned the volume on the TV down, and sure enough, what I just heard was a slight tapping noise. I looked around and didn't see anything out of place, so I assumed it must be a noise from a tree or something outside. Every time I turned the volume back up though, I heard that same tap. Finally, I turned off the TV altogether and started walking around the house. As my eyes adjusted to the darker room, I saw a man outside the window, fingernail pressed to the glass, making that tap 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 noise. He was smiling at me. I freaked out and went upstairs to check on the kid. The worst part is that there was not a phone upstairs, so I had to creep back down to grab a phone and call the police. I tried to avoid looking back at the window, but I snuck a glance. Sure enough, he was still there, just watching me as calmly as ever. I locked myself and the kid in his bedroom and waited for the police to arrive. When they finally showed up, they never found any traces of someone around the house. I suspect they thought I was just some kid playing a prank on them, but I know the person I saw was a fully grown man. He was just stood there watching me, enjoying the fear he caused me to feel that night. I'm an 18-year-old guy who lives with his mom. We don't live in the house I grew up in, but we are in the same neighborhood as my grandma's house, and only a minute away from all our aunts, uncles, and cousins. It's always been a nice and happy area for me because I grew up around here. To say it plainly, I love this place, and I feel comfortable almost everywhere in this city. Nothing bad has happened to me or any of my family members while we've lived in this town. It's close to the Gulf of Mexico, and it's full of chemical plants, thus workers from chemical plants and their families. Most people mind their own business and have a lot of respect for hard work and integrity. Of course, there are some crazies living here though. There was a body recently found in a storage unit. It was a woman who was murdered by her husband. He wasn't charged because he committed suicide shortly after. A man who used to work at the same power plant I work at now was arrested for killing a woman with his car, then driving away. The point being that sure, sometimes bad stuff does go on here, but most of the time it's all okay. That's why I think this event was such a shocking thing to me. It was a typical Thursday. I woke up at 7 a.m., went to work, and got off at 4. I went home and did all the normal stuff I usually do. Took a shower, played some video games, smoked a little weed, then ate dinner. Pretty good evening so far. My mom's friend April came over and stayed for a couple hours. She lives a block away and walked over, but didn't want to walk alone in the dark. My mom told me at around 9 p.m. that she was walking April back to her house, and it would only take a few minutes at most. I said, "Alright, I'll see you when you get back." Then they left. No more than a minute later, I thought I heard tapping on my window. It was so light and inconsistent, though, that I still didn't know if anyone was actually tapping. I felt a little paranoid, so I turned on some music to distract myself. I turned it down a minute or two later, though, when I thought I heard my back door open. It's very loud because of how old it is, and because of how we always keep a spare key in the lock, which jangles every time it's opened. I turned my music off and didn't make another noise for a whole minute. I didn't hear anything else, but I knew someone opened it. I knew someone was inside my house right now. I could just feel it in the air. I didn't hear footsteps or a voice or anything. It was completely silent. I was kind of scared. but I quickly told myself to grab the knife I keep in my desk drawer. I did feel a bit dumb because of the possibility I was just being paranoid, but better to be safe than sorry. Once again, it was silent for a while. I thought that if I acted like I had the upper hand over whoever was in the house, they might be intimidated or scared. I stood up and walked out of my bedroom, knife visibly in hand. I don't know why, but I whistled just one note. I took a few steps forward and was about to turn the corner. The back door would be in clear view. I stopped again and whistled once more, still thinking I was big and tough. I was about to walk around the corner and make a big show. I then heard something that made my hair stand on end. Whoever was inside my house whistled back to me, clearly coming from my living room. I was terrified. I peered around the corner and didn't see anyone there. The door was closed, but it was unlocked. I didn't know if I'd left it unlocked or not. I truly couldn't remember. My mom came home a few minutes later, and I didn't tell her because, I don't know, it was just weird and didn't make much sense. I really don't know what to think about what happened that night, but I know for sure someone whistled back to me. Even when I searched afterward, though, I could never find any evidence that anyone had ever been there. About 5 years ago, my husband Adam and I decided it was finally time to start looking to purchase a house. We'd always talked about buying an old fixer-upper home because we've had the idea that they hold more charm and character. Plus, we can appreciate a place that has its own quirks, and we love the thought of turning something run down into something beautiful again. With that being said, I grew up in a pretty rural farming town in Indiana that had more than its fair share of rundown houses. The surrounding areas had started to boom a little bit, with farmland being sold off and turned into new factory locations, along with new subdivisions for the people coming to work for them. I thought it would be a great place to start on our own house hunt. I figured we would be a lot closer to civilization than I used to be growing up, but not so much that we would be living a stone's throw away from our neighbors. Adam and I decided to take a drive one summer Sunday afternoon so I could show him some of the back roads of my hometown, and also see what some of the properties we checked out online looked like in person. As we were turning off the main road through town and further onto a more secluded country road, we noticed the very first house on the left was completely abandoned. We pulled into a small patch of the yard where the grass was shortest and where a gravel driveway used to be to further investigate this place. It was painted a deep green color, which made it almost invisible against the tall grass, sticker bushes, and weeds that had grown up around it. There was a massive tree in the front yard, and the branches and leaves helped to camouflage this place even further. The house looked as if it were at least 100 years old, and it looked like it had sat empty for decades. It looked neglected, weather-worn, and in some major need of love. In that moment, it seemed perfect. There was nothing but woods across the street, and no neighboring houses in sight. Adam and I thought it probably wouldn't hurt anyone if we just trespassed a little. I completely justified my reasoning by thinking that we were interested in buying this property. We were not here to cause trouble. We were doing someone a favor. We could take this burden of a house off someone's hands. We just needed to take a look around first. That's all. It's not like there were any no trespassing signs anywhere, so I was perfectly armed with my newfound inflated ignorance and arrogance to assess the property. He walked carefully through the brush toward the left side of the house, where we noticed a well that was still standing, complete with a bucket, a rope, and a handle, and the original overhang as well. My excitement for a picturesque country home was building. Directly across from the well, there was a side entrance into the house to what looked like an added-on mudroom. The screen door to the mudroom was closed. However, there was a wooden door behind it that was half open. We figured this was not really intrusive because we weren't breaking anything to get in. It was probably in the mid-90s outside that day, so when we entered, Adam went in first. We were met with this thick, stifling heat, the kind that holds so much humidity that it takes your breath away. What we thought was a mudroom was an extended pantry area, or canning kitchen. It was tiny with one window, an old rusted sink, a small stove, and the walls still held shelves of canned and spoiled vegetables. I remember thinking, oh yeah, this'll be great. I totally remember how to can, and we can have a garden as well. It had the doorway into the main part of the house. This is where my elation came to an end. Through the doorway was the kitchen. What remained of the cabinets and the sink were against the wall on the left, but they were either broken or hanging on for dear life. The kitchen connected to a wide-open living area, with one side having walls streaked with black that led halfway up to a sunken gray ceiling. It seemed there had been a fire at some point. The windows on that wall were filthy, covered in dust and ash. This room was so much darker. It should have been the middle of the day, but it was pitch black in there. My heart sank. I knew we wouldn't be able to afford a costly repair of a house fire, but I kept that disappointing thought to myself. The open living room area had not one stitch of furniture, save for one small wooden rocking horse a child would have. The floor was littered with magazines as well, as if someone had a giant stack of them and just threw them in the air to see where they would land. Curious as to what was in this big pile, I decided to check them out. Almost every single magazine was related to dolls in some way. Porcelain doll collecting, Barbie dolls, making dolls by hand, clothing for dolls. I felt a little creeped out by it, especially under the surveillance of the rocking horse's dead painted-on stare. I figured an old lady must have lived in the house before. We decided to check out another room that was connected to the half-burned living area. Through the doorway to the left was a weird combination of a molded stand-up shower with handicapped handles and an assisted toilet next to it, divided down the middle by a wall on the right. The wall was made entirely of built-in bookshelves. The shelves were full of paperwork, manila envelopes, and even more magazines. It was a weird setup, but perhaps these people liked to read while sitting on the toilet or something. My husband and I thought we could find out who the previous homeowners were, since some of the paperwork on top of the stack seemed to be old bills. If we wanted to look up the property records, at least now we would have a name to go on. I grabbed a stack of papers and began to flip through them, when about halfway through, they changed from being old telephone bills to print out colored pictures from the internet of porcelain dolls. I put the stack of papers back on the shelf and picked up a small red 5-star notebook. I started from the beginning, casually leafing through. Daily entries of medications, blood pressure, glucose measurements. About 20 pages in, the entries started to change entirely. They became crude drawings of twisted faces done in red ink. The faces had horns or bloody fangs. Then full-on drawings of devils appeared. I wanted to believe a child had picked this up to doodle in, but I felt like this was something much different than that. After the drawings, the notebook became someone's personal journal, and what I assumed was an elderly man's cursive handwriting. It told of how he knew he was coming toward the end of his life, and how he remembered being just a young boy when his mother passed away. He described in detail how the wake for his mother was held in the front room of this house, and how during those nights he crawled on top of his mother's body in her coffin to sleep. I couldn't believe what I was reading. A sudden rush of goosebumps came over me. I immediately showed it to Adam, flipping to the pages of devils and snarled faces, then read aloud the stranger's memories, just to see if it was the same the second time around. While I was reading the rest of the notebook, he continued rifling through the mountains of papers. One stack not only had more printed pictures of dolls, but now they contained pictures of real women in torture bondage, ball gags or electrical tape placed over their mouths, jumper cables on them. being hog-tied with rope. Sometimes there was more than one woman in the picture. It felt as if a brick had been tossed into my stomach. For some, those images wouldn't be disturbing, but in the context of our visit, my panic was starting to grow. I was torn between wanting to find out more and getting the hell out of this house. Adam reassured me that while it was on the creepy side, it wasn't anything to lose my mind over. The burned-out living area was separated from the rest of the house by a staircase. The staircase had a room directly across from it, and a small hallway on the other side that led to the main room at the front of the house. We debated on going up to the second floor, but decided against it. We already felt as if we were roasting in an oven, and were unsure of the stability of this second story. Going into the room across the staircase, we noticed a few more doll magazines on the floor. There were also scattered plastic doll pieces here and there. To the left was the original fireplace with a couple tiny vases on the mantel. Smack dab in the middle was a framed picture of an elderly couple, smiling and happy. These certainly weren't the type of people that would have pictures of women bound and gagged hidden away in their bedroom. To the right was a big bay window, and smack dab in the middle was a yellowed piece of paper with faded black printed handwriting on it. It was for anyone on the outside of the house to see. It said, "If you're here to talk about Jesus, go away." Something in my brain was now starting to nag me. Something wasn't computing correctly for me. Thinking back, my mind was putting together that an elderly couple in this town would more than likely be pretty religious, and by the super small chance they weren't, it would have been gossiped about for sure. Had someone seen that in the window? It was as if the house had held two very different personalities within. I told my husband I wanted to go into just one last room down the little hallway, and then I would be ready to leave. Going down the small hallway, it became darker and cooler. It took a few seconds for our eyes to adjust to the difference in lighting in here, but the change in air was noticeable immediately. It was as if we had stepped into a cave. The smell was dank and left a dampness on our skin. Once things came into clear focus, that's when we saw it. The main reason our senses had shifted so quickly. There was a large hole in the floor. At first, we thought that perhaps the wooden floor was so weak it had simply caved in on its own, or the roof had leaked and caused this exact area of the floor to rot away. Upon getting closer, though, it became obvious this was not the case. The hole was about 5 feet across and went straight down into the earth. There was about 2 feet of space between the remaining floor and dirt. This hole was there because it had been made there. My husband and I looked at each other. My heart was racing so fast that I thought it would burst in my chest. I said aloud to him while pointing, "What the hell is this? Why is this here?" I panicked, my breathing becoming more rapid and shallow. Nothing was making sense, and yet the thoughts that had been running in the background of my brain were all coming together like a jigsaw puzzle. That was when we noticed something else. There were old, molded-over driver's licenses just thrown around haphazardly. Checkbooks, credit cards, as if someone had emptied their purse or wallet in this room and then just disappeared into this hole. I was overcome with terror and dread. I had to get out of this house. My skin felt like static, as if my whole body had been taken over by the sensation of when your foot falls asleep. My mind just told me to run. Without having to speak, Adam quickly took me by the arm and led us back down the hallway through the burned-out living room and kitchen, out the side canning room, and back out into the light of day. We ran back down the mangled and tangled driveway to the car. Thinking back on it, I got the eerie feeling we weren't the only two people in the house that day. We drove past it about a year later, and the large tree in the front yard had all its branches removed. All of the windows had been boarded shut, and after doing some research, we found out the land it sits on is for sale, and the house itself had been condemned. There was a time back in the 70s that I didn't have a place to live really, at least not a static home. What I did have was an old pickup truck and an old teardrop camper. I was able to do odd jobs here and there to get some money for gas and food. It wasn't too difficult back then, finding places to park in order to get some sleep. Mostly though, I would just find myself a nice place off the beaten path where I could have some privacy. Mostly when you find a place to spend the night back then, you would be able to sleep throughout the whole night. Occasionally, depending on where you were, a police officer or a park ranger may come along and tell you to move. Rangers rarely did that though, unless they suspected you of doing drugs or some other illegal activity. I somehow doubt that nowadays young people could get away with that as easily as we did back nearly 50 years ago. I don't have a lot of stories really that are too interesting in a scary way from the times I lived out of that camper. There is one single story though that I recall, which when I tell people about today, it sends chills up their spine. It happened while I was traveling through the mountains. There were a lot of off-roads you can take into the woods. Occasionally, when I had a sufficient amount of food, I would take off to one of them, park my truck and camper, and spend as much time there as I could, before it was time to go off and find another job, just to turn around and do it all over again. This was during the colder months, even for being out in the mountains. Despite that, there hadn't really been much snow at all during that time. It was still during the period when leaves and needles were turning brown, and the leaves were beginning to fall. This particular night was about the third night in a row that I had been lodging out in that spot, and the first night of some extremely strong winds. I don't know how many people are familiar with teardrop campers, but I know you've probably seen them before. They're those really tiny trailers you see being pulled around that are shaped like teardrops. There's not really much room inside them, but if you don't really care about space in the first place, then that won't really matter to you. Thing is, they're also very, very light and shake really badly when it's windy outside. The wind was howling through the trees and shaking the camper pretty hard that night. I knew this was going to make it very hard for me to sleep later on, but I wasn't really worried about that. I was just having some beers and listening in on the radio. The gusts of wind would hit the camper, shaking it and sometimes really startling me with how strong the wind was. It was pretty late at night when the wind really began hitting my camper super hard. I thought I heard something smack up against the camper physically. Actually, it kind of sounded like someone had taken their hand and was now pounding it against the wall. The first time it happened, I thought maybe a park ranger had come along and wanted to know what I was doing out there. I got up, opened the door, and checked outside, but there was no one standing outside. I stepped out into the windy night and looked around, checking to see if there was a ranger's truck somewhere outside. There wasn't anything like that around either. I assumed the pounding sound must have either been some debris, or maybe even a part of the camper itself. I gave up and went back inside. It must have been about 20 minutes later when I began to hear a really similar noise. Again, I got up to go and check it out. I didn't think it could be a ranger this time, but maybe there was a part of the camper that was loose or about to come off or something. I wanted to find out before a part got permanently blown away in the wind. I got up and went out with my flashlight. It was really, really dark outside at this time, but fortunately the flashlight I had with me was a good one. I spent about 15 minutes walking around, searching all over the camper. However, I didn't see anything wrong. I went back into it and just hoped that nothing else would happen. Of course, it happened a third time later on. I was beginning to get very frustrated, which wasn't anything like I had felt the previous times. Even upon the third checking though, I didn't find anything at all wrong. I began to wonder if it was something on the inside or something on the underside. I didn't know, but I knew I wouldn't be able to figure it out until the next day, when it was light outside. I was able to eventually go to sleep. I had enough beers that despite the weird experiences of that night, it wasn't too difficult for me to drift right off to sleep. By the morning, the wind had calmed down quite a lot actually. It was light enough outside that I thought I would go out and check all over the camper, just to make sure everything was alright. What I saw upon inspecting the trailer is something I would never ever forget. Someone had written something on my door. If you checked in the truck, you would be dead. I immediately looked over at the truck. The driver's side door was ajar. I'd always left it unlocked because I never thought of any reason to lock it. Especially not this far out. I was always inside the camper anyway. I thought about how I never thought to look at the truck at all the night before. Whoever had been slapping the side of the camper must have then quietly snuck themselves back into the cab of the truck and pulled the door closed too without slamming it. I had never considered looking in there. I don't know if it was just a prank or what, but I guess I'm lucky I never had to find out. This is something that just recently happened. I guess it's more strange than really horrifying. I don't know if you'll get scared when hearing it, but I got pretty scared while I was experiencing it. I live in a rural area just outside of a really small town. It's pretty cool, by the way. I get the experience of living in the country while simply being able to walk into town if I need to. I could drive, but if I think the weather is okay, it makes more sense to walk and get the exercise I feel. So the other day I wanted to walk into town and visit the liquor store. That was another reason that I walked, because I thought that if I was going to drink, I should probably walk beforehand as a way to earn what I was doing sort of. It was nice outside anyway, not too cold as it had been recently. The dirt road I lived on went downhill, then connected with a highway. I had to walk along the highway to the main road that led to the shopping area by where we lived. This was all set by the exit of an interstate, so there were a lot of shops in the area. There was only a couple of gas stations alongside the regular highway though. As I got to the bottom of the hill, about to turn onto the highway, I noticed there was someone walking behind me. As he passed me by, since I wasn't walking too quickly, he turned around and looked at me. While this wasn't an unusual thing to do, he kept eye contact with me longer than someone normally would. He almost looked like a character from The Hills Have Eyes, and the look on his face was complete contempt. Needless to say, it was very unnerving. What he did next, though, right after he passed me by, was just really strange. It turns out he was carrying a pencil in his right hand. There was a small abandoned building right before the gas station, and we were both walking through its really small parking lot. He walked up to the sidewalk in front of the small building, leaned down with his pencil in hand, and drew a line that went across the entire length of the sidewalk. He walked on toward the gas station on the left side of the road, while I went across the road, since I had to cross it anyway. I watched him at the gas station, drawing his pencil along the sidewalk in front of it as well. Then afterward, he went inside. I hoped that would be the last time I would have to interact with him. I just kept walking and turned on the road that all the businesses were on. I had a bit of a way to go. When I crossed down a side street, however, I noticed someone walking down it toward me. I was a bit unnerved when I realized it was once again this weird guy with his pencil. I tried my best to walk a little faster. I didn't think he had any reason to care about me at all, but I kept noticing him going up to businesses and doing that pencil thing. I was fortunate the guy kept doing this, because I was just walking in a straight path without making any stops. There was no way he would be able to catch up to me. The closer I got to the store, I stopped noticing him walking behind me. I went inside, got the stuff I had to get, and began on my way back. I was really happy that I didn't see him right away. I was even happier when I kept not seeing him as I walked along the road and turned back onto the highway where I'd first interacted with him. I didn't have any real reason to think he was dangerous per se, but the look he had given me and the really weird behavior was just telling me something was off about him. Mostly though, I had forgotten about it when I reached the original building I had run into the guy at. Now, that building where he'd given me that weird look was right on the corner of a dirt road that led to my house. As I turned the corner, I suddenly jumped in surprise when I noticed the guy was waiting right there, leaning on the side of the building. I'm pretty sure he saw me startled too, and for some reason that really seemed to set him off. "Hey!" he screamed at me as I began walking away from him. "Don't walk away from me! What's your damn problem?" I turned to him for a moment. "I don't have a problem with you. I just didn't expect you to be standing there. You scared me. It's no big deal." "You've been watching me the whole damn day," he said to me. "You've got some damn problem with me. You better tell me before I kick your ass." I'll be honest with you. I was in no way scared of this guy's threat. I had easily 50 pounds on him and was not too sure on experience with getting into fights. That wasn't the point though. Not only was I not looking for any sort of confrontation, I now knew this guy really had something wrong with him. All I wanted to do was get home. I didn't answer him this time. I just kept walking on even faster. It wasn't until I heard some noise on the road that I turned around and noticed he was following me. He wasn't following right on my butt or he wasn't following right close behind me or anything, but it was still very uncomfortable and I just couldn't relax. When I got to my house, I unlocked the door, went inside and locked it again. I then watched out the kitchen window. The man was still there. He watched me from outside before he began walking up my driveway toward my porch. I didn't hesitate. I called the cops immediately. Although I did live in a rural area, it was close enough to the town that it didn't take them too long to get there. The man was caught skulking around the side of my house, trying to run off as the police arrived. I let them know about the threats the man had leveled at me as I had walked by him earlier. I also let them know what he had been doing, walking up to businesses and drawing on their front walks with a pencil. He was taken away by the police. That was a few days ago. I also noticed something after the police had already left. There was a pencil mark all across the length of my entire front porch. I had no idea what the guy is up to, but he definitely had his share of problems. I liked going camping in the area around my rural home when I was a kid and teenager, although I sometimes had friends come with me when I went. Often, I would go all by myself. My parents were quite the country folk, and my dad really encouraged it. He had taken me hunting a few times, but honestly, that wasn't really my thing. I did like being out in nature and being away from people though, so for me, camping was the regular thing. I also tended to go and stay out for several days at a time, or as long as I could really. I always tried to go further and further into the woods each time I went out camping. We lived in a really hilly area with a few houses scattered about. It didn't seem like the land was ever used for anything, unless maybe it was hunting by people who owned it. Nevertheless, I would never run into other people while I was out camping. I would try to find new places to experience so I could have a nice time while I was out. When I was 15 years old, I went out camping on a late summer day. School was going to be starting pretty soon, and I wanted as much time as I could get to myself first. I would set up camp each night and try to explore just a little more the following day. I was having a pretty good time. On the third night I was out, however, things changed a lot. I had set up my third camp in an area I had never been in before. I was inside of my tent reading a book by the light of my lantern. Several times I thought I could hear what sounded like someone whistling coming from the surroundings of my camp. It wasn't windy really that night, and the only other noises were normal bugs and frogs. The same stuff you'd hear when you were in the middle of nowhere. I could have sworn I kept hearing what sounded like someone whistling though. Reasonably, I started getting really paranoid about this. Running into another person during the daytime would have been fine. If I was trespassing, they likely would have told me to just leave. However, running into anyone walking around the woods in the middle of the night was frightening on a whole nother level. After a bit, I heard the whistling come closer and closer. It was clear to me by now that this was definitely a person out there. I turned out the lantern and hoped that whoever this was had not seen the light. The whistling was close enough by that point, though, that it was very unlikely. I remained as still as possible, just hoping beyond hope I would not be noticed. The whistling continued to get closer and closer before it suddenly stopped altogether. It was still quiet outside, and I kept listening in to see if there would be any further noises. For a while, there was nothing, just the sounds of the night around me. I guess I finally began to relax again. I wasn't sure if the whistling was not my imagination, but I guess that whoever was out there either hadn't noticed me, or they didn't really care that I was out there. That's when suddenly something hit up against the side of my tent. I jumped up and noticed a knife had been plunged through the back wall. I caught a glimpse of a man as he sliced the tent open, but it was too dark and quick to make out any features. I reacted on instinct. The entrance to my tent wasn't zipped up, so I was able to bolt out as quickly as possible, leaving all my belongings behind. I ran and ran and ran, having no idea if anyone was chasing after me or not. I kept running until I was completely winded. I had a small keychain flashlight that I was able to look around with. It didn't seem like I had been followed, which was only a small relief. I was still terrified. I didn't dare go back to the tent. Instead, I did my best to find my way home in the dark with nothing but that small flashlight. It took me quite a while to do so, but eventually I finally made it. My dad came with me the next day to look for my things. We found the tent. Nothing had been taken, but the tent was completely cut open on one side. My dad figured it was someone who was just trying to scare me, since they didn't take anything, nor did they chase after me. Regardless though, it was still scary, and it did keep me from camping, for a little while at least. I love metal concerts. The atmosphere, the flashing lights, the pounding of the beat up your spine, there's really nothing like it. That very same atmosphere, though, can be a breeding ground for a lot of dangerous activity. I learned that the hard way at my last concert. I went with a friend to see In This Moment, Avatar, New Year's Day, and my personal favorite, Ice Nine Kills, as part of their Terror Tour. It sounds ominous already, but trust me, that concert was amazing. They played all our favorites, and like the teenage metalheads we were, we screamed along with all our lungs put into it. New Year's Day went first as an opener, and the flashing lights caused spots in my eyes. Avatar went next, and the first half of their set went flawlessly. They played up the ominous angle of being with the devil between songs, and I got chills as the voice reverberated up my spine. They started up one of my favorite songs from their new album. I remember the gleam in my friend's eyes as she grabbed my arm and shook me in sheer excitement. The music and vocals built and built. The crowd was going absolutely feral down on the floor. I think I even saw someone in the pit get ousted up into the air and crowd surf. The chorus was just about to start when the lead vocalist froze in his tracks, let out a strangled "oh" into the mic. The other members stopped playing a second later. The only sound was the quickly fading reverb from the amps on stage. The crowd seemed to hold its breath. Little puffs of smoke from the crowd of bodies on the floor were visible. I could swear they represented someone whose soul had just been scared out of them. People around us started murmuring, everyone wondering what was going on. while the singer was trying to compose things. No one would tell us anything. All of a sudden, he shouted into the mic, "Security! Can we get security here? Now!" The lights in the arena flicked on one by one, flooding the space with stark white light. After over an hour in the dark, it was almost blinding. After a second of blinking away spots, we could see that near the front of the stage, a small circle had formed in the crowd, giving a wide berth to someone in the middle. That someone was crumpled into a heap on the floor, and they'd started screaming. Security pushed their way through the remaining concert-goers and immediately ran to the guy with first aid in tow. They looked like they were struggling to turn him over, and the guy curled around himself as if in pain. I couldn't see very well from where I was sitting, but it seemed like his hands were clasped firmly against his stomach. When one of the security guys finally got him onto his back, the guy's hands accidentally fell to the side. And that's when what can only be described as a baseball-sized bubble of blood exploded across his shirt. Apparently, he'd scooped up the blood in his hands and was praying it didn't fall out. Security immediately realized their mistake and pressed firmly against the wound. People in the crowd began to call 911, and 20 minutes later, EMS and police showed up, with the full flashing lights and stretchers and everything. We were all told to stay calm, and were quickly directed outside to the parking lot. My friend and I clung to each other through the surge, so we wouldn't get separated. I remember that we didn't speak for a long time, even on the drive back. We saw some news that was written about the incident about a month later. Apparently, someone thought that when the guy shoved up against them in the mosh pit, he was hitting on their girlfriend or something. That's when they pulled out a knife and began stabbing him in the stomach. They pled guilty, with the defense that they were extremely high at the time, but that didn't lessen the severity of their sentence. As to how this person managed to sneak a knife past security personnel, we have no idea. It just goes to show you that even though a rough and tumble concert can be fun, it can also lead to reckless or even dangerous situations when emotions are running that high. The Taste of Waterville, Maine is an annual food festival that showcases food from every corner of the town and basically gives locals and outsiders alike a taste of everything it has to offer. It has everything you could think of: small independent Thai places, chain chicken wing restaurants, family-owned pancake restaurants, and even a place where breweries could sample their products. That last part is pretty significant, because last time I went, I had recently turned 21 and was legally able to buy drinks from the stands if I wanted to. I did take advantage of that. The 21 plus section was located a little removed from the rest of the festival, surrounded by ropes so those without a blue wristband couldn't get in so easily. It was right next to a big field where a band played for the festival guests. This is relevant because I'm pretty sure I got a new sample drink every time a new song started. I don't really remember much clearly after that, so all that I'm about to say is scattered memories with a sober brain to fill in the pieces. I remember standing by a strawberry beer stand in the corner for a company whose name escapes me when a random girl walked up to me and started chatting. She said her name was Amanda, and I'm not gonna lie, she was pretty cute. She had long blonde locks in a braid, was athletic looking, and wearing glasses as well. Exactly my type, really. She was extremely physical right away, touching my arms and all that, and complimenting me quite a bit. I'd never really received that sort of attention from a girl before, so I've got to be honest, I was really into the vibe we were building. I wanted to get to know her. So I drunkenly offered to buy us some food, and she agreed. Together, we waited in line for some chicken wings. I was weirdly happy to find out we both liked them on the spicier side, and grabbed a table. I sat across from her, just chatting about anything we could think of really, messily eating wings and having an amazing time. I remember the top of her head had a pink tinge from the sunset behind her, which made her look even more beautiful to me. Through the haze of beer, I was determined to get her number, so I asked her outright. She seemed kind of surprised but happy at the same time, and took out a Sharpie of all things from her bag, wrote her number right across my arm. It was just like in all those movies I'd seen. Then she smiled at me. Her eyes sparkled with mischief, as she suggested going back behind the trees for some privacy, if you know what I mean. Who was I to say no, especially with my inhibitions removed? She grabbed my arm and practically dragged me through the crowd. A little ways off from the festival was this old footbridge that sped across to an adjacent river. It was lined on the other side by an old abandoned toll shack and a stretch of trees, the perfect place for the amount of privacy we needed. I remember my shoes clacking hard on the wood as Amanda led the way. My gaze was drawn to the river. The water was rushing hard, and it turned a deep blue-black with the already set sun. I remember vaguely thinking the bridge might snap and send us tumbling down 40 feet. I quickly got over it as we reached the shack, though. Amanda pulled me inside with a strength she didn't look like she had. I was on cloud 9, anticipating the first kiss and everything that happens after. That's when Amanda's entire personality changed, and things went to hell. She scowled and pressed me against the wall, hands on my chest. I leaned toward her to ask what was wrong, when someone ran up behind her and punched me square in the face and pushed me down to the ground. I could only see that the person was big and a guy. He kept wailing on me. My eyes swam, and the last thing I remember is looking up at Amanda, who then started laughing. I woke up a few hours later with one hell of a headache and a hangover. I felt exhausted, disoriented. I couldn't remember where I was or why I was here. When I tasted blood on my lip, it all came flooding back. The festival, the fountain of beer, Amanda. My wallet and phone were missing, so I couldn't call anyone for help, or even what time it was. My only option was to stagger out of the shack and stumble across the bridge, face coated in what felt like a thick layer of dried blood. It felt like my nose was out of shape as well. Maybe broken, maybe not. Eventually, a lady on the road asked me if I was okay, and if there was someone she could call for me. I said yes, and she even offered to drive me to the hospital. My nose was definitely broken. Aside from the corrective surgery, there wasn't much they could do. I'm still breathing okay, by the way. As for Amanda and her partner in crime, they were never found. I don't know if that was even her real name. They did try the number she wrote across my arm, but that turned out to be a fake too. Lesson learned. Don't let random cute girls drag you across a bridge without being sober, I guess. Or at all, really. Against all our better judgment, my roommate got us an apartment on Craigslist. We were scrambling to find a place before we graduated college, desperate for our independence, and for her to avoid flying across the country back home. The rent was cheaper than any other place we'd looked at. We'd have to heat it ourselves and pay for internet, but hey, beggars can't be choosers, right? It turned out to be a trailer for rent on the landlord's personal property. It was pretty nice, all things considered. Carpeted floor, a spacious and open kitchen with a bar setup, and 2 large bedrooms. It was all open in a pretty blue color too, which added to the value of the place for us. There was even a garden set up out front, with some flowers already in bloom. My roommate had communicated with the landlord a couple of times. Well, I'd only ever seen him once by the time he gave us the keys, so while we didn't know him that well, he seemed like a perfectly average guy, middle-aged with a wife and young grandkids, well-meaning as well. He was skeptical of us being so young, since most of his tenants up till this point had been older retirees, but once he saw that we never threw huge parties or missed a rent payment, or had our music turned up too loud, He started to quickly relax. That's when things got weird though. It was in small ways at first, things you wouldn't really notice, or you might even find thoughtful. He drove by often to make sure everything was working okay. He'd offer us rides into town for work, and once even wanted to pay for our groceries for no reason at all. We thought we'd hit the landlord jackpot, and were ready to live the rest of our 2-year lease worry-free. Things quickly escalated when he asked my roommate out to dinner. The request seemed innocent enough, but when I looked at her face after she told me, her expression said she was a little uncomfortable. I asked if he meant both of us, as a get-to-know-you sort of thing, or if he did that with all his tenants to build a better relationship. After some serious thinking, though, we decided he had not-so-good intentions, and just let his offer hang in the air. Maybe he'd get the hint that she wasn't interested, without any of the complicated stuff that might come with directly turning him down. My roommate didn't bring it up again, and life went by as normal for a couple of weeks. He still seemed friendly and still offered us rides to work if we needed it, but every once in a while we noticed he would look a little angry. Then a smile would slip on his face, and he would return to his usual self, almost as if it was a mask he put on. He must have sensed we were quickly cooling off about him, so he pressed to go out to dinner with my roommate again. This time he made it clear that I would not be invited along. This time it was also over text. So my roommate at least had something in writing she could turn to if things escalated further. And escalated was much too small a word to describe what happened next. He started to drive by our place in his white truck every single day. Sometimes he wouldn't even say anything, just sit out front with the engine running. I always felt a cold chill run down my spine whenever he turned up, and I can't even imagine how my roommate must have felt every time we heard his truck rev outside. It got to the point where we put our shades up in the living room almost 24/7. It was a real shame, because we both loved the sunlight that came through the space. It led to our new home feeling oppressive, dark, and gloomy. More than once, my roommate said she felt as if the walls were closing in on her. In a sense, they were. She rarely went outside unless she had to, just in case the landlord was skulking outside. Even then, she asked me more often than not to go shopping for the both of us. The one silver lining in all of this is that between the two of us, we were able to compile quite a bit of evidence. The text conversations, detailed notations of when he would do his little drive-bys, his attitude whenever he saw us, the pressure to get my roommate all alone. The problem was finding a place to live if he kicked us out for going to someone with this. Rent in our area is not cheap, and it took us forever to find the trailer in the first place, so we either had to move fast with a big chunk of money or cut our losses. The other part we were concerned about was the landlord doing something even more drastic if he felt insulted, following us, breaking in, or worse. Either way, something had to be done. We arranged a ride with a friend to take us to the local police station and booked it off the property so the landlord wouldn't catch us leaving. Unfortunately, since the guy hadn't technically broken the law or done anything illegal, they couldn't do much more than contacting him via letter and advising him to leave us alone. It was nothing binding like a restraining order, but it was something on the record at least. Needless to say, we moved out not long after. I live in a small apartment that rents from a well-established renting company now, and I've never taken up offers from Craigslist again. As far as I know, neither has my roommate, but I can't exactly say for sure. Growing up, the way I would describe my grandmother's house was brown. Popcorn cream ceilings bled into tan walls that spilled into a brown linoleum floor in her kitchen. The living room walls were a deep chestnut brown that seemed to absorb all light coming in through the shuttered window, if any seemed to get in at all. Even the carpet covering the rest of the house was brown, chocolate to be exact, or perhaps the color of mud depending on how you looked at it. All in all, the house had a dark, dreamy effect to it that I really couldn't explain until much later in my life, and by that time the explanation horrified me. This isn't one of those stories where your relative turns out to be a murderer or goes crazy and tries to kill you. This is a different, more subtle kind of horror, the kind that anyone can face anywhere at any time without even knowing, especially if you're a child or someone who doesn't recognize the danger. And it all started with the carpet. From early elementary to 6th grade, I would go to Grandma's after school most days so someone could watch me while my mom went to work. She worked nights in the next town over, which my grandma also happened to live in, so it worked out. Everything was fine for a countless amount of days. Me, my grandma, and my parents had a routine going. My mom would drop me off, I would watch TV and eat dinner with Grandma. Then my dad would come get me a few hours later when he got off work for the day. It wasn't a perfect routine looking back, but it worked well for our family. I would lay on that carpet for hours, brushing my hands over the soft fibers and even pressing my face down into it to use it as a pillow. It always gave off a unique smell I couldn't quite place. Damp, kind of musty. It was almost overpowering at times, enough to routinely make me sick. Though I didn't know that was what was happening at the time. I would just get a runny nose and a pretty bad cough every few weeks. My parents chalked it up to a bug going around at school, but it was much more than that. Around that same time, my grandma's health began to rapidly decline as well. She developed a cough that lasted for months, and she started to have tiny gaps in her memory. Small things at first, like where she'd misplaced her keys. She also seemed more frail than before, as if she didn't have the energy to move around much at all. I realized that part might have come from just aging, but something didn't seem right about it. When I was 12, my parents finally decided I was old enough to stay home for a couple hours after school, which gratefully lightened their workload for the day and their gas money. Strangely enough, within only a single month, my symptoms entirely disappeared. The smell still lingered in my memory, but I was all in all a healthy kid once again. The same couldn't be said for my grandma, though. Her physical and mental health rapidly declined. Eventually, she had to be moved to a nursing home when I was 16, and that's when the terrible truth was discovered. Her entire house had been infected with black mold. Inside the walls, down through the cellar, and most notably directly under the thin brown carpet that coated the living room. The same carpet I pressed my face against, day after day for years, indirectly inhaling hundreds of mold spores. Now, that may not seem like the scariest thing in the world. After all, molding food in your fridge just gets thrown away and forgotten in 5 minutes. But let me tell you about the effects of exposure to black mold, especially when it's long-term. Body aches, pains, wheezing, cough, shortness of breath, memory issues, and weight loss, all leading to the most dangerous outcome of all, mycotoxicosis, or mold poisoning. Now it all made sense. My constant illness, Grandma's frailty and memory issues, everything. With how much mold they found in the house, we were being poisoned the entire time. My parents immediately rushed to get me checked out, but fortunately, no long-term damage had taken place, and I was able to fully recover. My grandma was a different story, though. Living day in and day out in that mold-infested house had accelerated her developing Alzheimer's, and she never fully recovered. This is my dad's story from about 35 years ago. I'll tell this from his perspective, exactly as it was told to me. I grew up on the outskirts of Portland, Oregon, and when I was younger, my friends and I went camping pretty often. It was something we could do together, drink and have fun being underaged. When I was about 18, my friends and I decided one weekend to go camping near a lake called Small Fry. It's not too far from Portland itself, but far enough to get away. It was a pretty last-minute plan, so we didn't bring much other than some blankets and a case of beer my older brother had bought for us. After school on Friday, we headed out. Once we got there, we found a cleared-out area that we could easily park our car in. At first, we made a small fire and drank a few beers, but we quickly got bored and decided we would go out for a midnight swim. The area we parked in wasn't near an actual trail to the lake, but it was only about a half-mile away. We knew what direction to go in. My 3 friends and I were pretty buzzed, as we were somewhat lightweights at that age. We decided to head out into the forest, toward where the lake was. This was back in the 80s, so we didn't have cell phones with maps on them to double-check we were going in the right direction. We trudged through the forest, completely sure we were going the right way. I think it was about 15 minutes since we'd left the campsite, when suddenly the air around us seemed to change. It was a warm summer night, and it was probably around 70 degrees, but as we kept walking further, it felt like it was getting colder and colder. Suddenly, I felt all the hairs on my body stick straight up, and the 4 of us all quickly turned around and ran back towards the campsite. We didn't talk. Not even a single word was muttered to each other about turning back around. I never ran that fast in my life. As bad as it sounds, my mindset in that moment was that I couldn't be the slowest, as I didn't want it to be my life in danger that night. I can't exactly explain why, but in that exact moment we were all in that fight or flight mode, and we decided to run for our lives. I remember feeling as if there was a presence behind me, not even a person maybe, but just something that wanted to harm us. We bolted back to the car quickly and unlocked it. We all hopped in and drove straight home. We left the fire burning at the campsite, and all the clothes and blankets we brought with us were left as well. The car ride home was completely silent. We got back to my house, and my friends hopped in their cars and left. We never talked about that night since. A few weeks later, it was finally summer. My family went on yearly camping trips with a few other families that were close to us. One night, as a group of about 20 of us were sitting by the fire, telling stories and just talking about life in general, someone from one of the other families brought up a weird hiking story they'd recently experienced. He explained that he and his wife, along with a few of their friends, had decided to go hiking on a Saturday. When they arrived, they were surprised to see that no one else was out there. It was a known hiking spot, so they figured that it would be pretty busy on a Saturday. The group of them hiked up the trail, and they soon got to the top of a cliff that overlooked a lake. When they got to the top, he felt as if he had no voice. The group of them quickly turned around and began to hike back down, walking much faster than normal. They didn't talk at all, just apparently decided they didn't want to stay, not even taking in the view. They had brought lunches with them and all talked about taking some pictures too, but instead they all hurried down the trail, not talking to each other at all. They all just had this gut feeling that they had to get out of there. None of them spoke to each other on the way home, and no one brought it up since. I asked where this incident took place, never mentioning I'd had a similar experience. The man said it all took place on Small Fry Lake. Honestly, that scared the crap out of me, as I just had that same experience. I didn't want to say anything though, as my parents were visibly concerned. I didn't want them trying to tell me I couldn't go camping in that area again. Maybe it's not the scariest story, but I'm curious to know if anyone else has been to that area and had a similar experience. When I was talking to that man and his wife, they both said they had this gut feeling that they were living the last few seconds of their lives. The man said he even started to see his life flashing before his eyes as he hurried back down the hill. I don't know what's going on at that lake and what made us all feel that way, but there's definitely something not right about that place. I've never believed in the supernatural, so I don't know if there's another explanation or something. All I know is I'll never be going back up there ever again. When I was early in my 20s, I moved to Southern California with my aunt. Once I had a job established and a steady income, I found an apartment that was really affordable at $350 a month plus utilities. That's the first red flag really, because California is not cheap. The other residents in the apartment were a 45-year-old male named Zach and a 45-year-old woman named Tina. They weren't a couple, and Tina was a little difficult to deal with, but this story is really about Zach and his friend Mike. Mike and Zach were childhood friends, and Mike lived in the same apartment complex as us. He was over a lot because of this. Every time I would come home from work, they would be polishing off a handle of vodka, then would go out. I didn't really think much of this, other than, damn, these guys really can put it away. I wasn't really comfortable in this living situation, but it was cheap and I was in school. I just tried to make the best of it. I got along well with Zach for the most part, if it was just him around. Mike was just a time bomb though. Here are just a few instances of the behavior that gradually got worse over time. The first incident, Zach invited me out with Mike and another friend of theirs out to a local bar. It was a couple of miles away, and I was comfortable being around Zach. I got into the passenger side of his truck. I didn't have any negative interactions with anyone until this point. Mike just suddenly went ballistic in our complex parking lot about how I was selfish and had no business being in the front seat because I wasn't Zach's girlfriend. It was quite strange to say the least. Here was a man the same age as my father throwing a tantrum over not getting the passenger seat. I just got out and went back to my apartment. My first rent check bounced, and I apologized to Zach. I discovered that my checks had misprinted the account number and paid in cash. I paid off the bounce check fee as well. I thought that was all okay, until I got home one evening and Mike was over as normal. He started interrogating me on why I couldn't pay my rent. I was only 22 at the time and didn't really want an issue. I simply said, hey, I apologized and took care of it. Even though Mike didn't live in the apartment, he just would not let this go. He would just scream at me, saying I was lazy and I should be evicted immediately. The iPhone 6 and 6 Plus came out around this time, and Mike got that phone model. He told me he would let me look at it if I went down on him. It was uncomfortable and awkward. I mean, what do you even say to something like that? Especially when this guy is always trying to scream and yell at you. We weren't friends, and we never really had a single good interaction together, so I just kind of did finger guns and went, you got me. I ran off to my room. It's important to note that Mike and Zach both had 2 DUIs. Zach was a school teacher and ended up being let go because of them. However, both men continued to drink excessively, all the time. I had to have a key made for the lock on my bedroom door because it would get violent a lot, and that was my only safety net. A lot of other instances continued to happen, but this one takes the cake really. Zach and Mike had gone out and taken an Uber to whatever local bar. I'd gotten home and went straight to my room as always. I heard the front door swing open, and Mike was mad drunk, screaming his head off about how he'd lost his new iPhone. The guy started beating on my bedroom door, demanding to be let in because he knew I had his phone on me. I cracked open my door. He stepped away with his fist balled up, like he was going to punch me in the face. I told him I didn't have his phone. Mike circled back again to the fact that my rent check had bounced the first time, and obviously I needed to steal for the money. He demanded he come into my room and tear it apart, looking for the stolen phone. Of course, I told him absolutely not, and shut and locked the door in his face. Mike started banging on my door trying to unlock it, threatening to kill me and saying he was going to rear me and I would get what I deserved for being a thief. Lots of other gross and scary things. I was told if I called the police, he would beat me to a bloody pulp. This was especially scary to me because my aunt was my only family nearby, and she wasn't really helpful at all. She just told me to be an adult and deal with it. Other than that, I didn't really have a support system. I told Zach a couple of days later I would be moving out immediately and would not be paying the rent for that month. Out of Zach's dark bedroom, Mike popped out with this creepy, sinister smile, saying bye in an almost taunting voice. I hurried into my room and locked my door. I could hear Zach blaming Mike for me moving out, and Mike just continued to call me names and ask how I had the money to move. The iPhone was found in the end for anyone who's curious. It had fallen out of his pocket in the Uber he was in, but obviously the first step to finding his iPhone was to flip out on me for no reason versus calling the Uber driver. This was almost a decade ago. I don't know what happened to that dysfunctional pair, but I wish them nothing but the worst. I live alone in a somewhat busy neighborhood. This happened about a year ago. It was winter time, and I live in a climate that typically gets a lot of snow. Not only was there already some snow on the ground, but it was also very cold. One night I was at home by myself when it started to snow. It was going quite a lot as well. I had heard about a large snowstorm that was supposed to impact the area, so I had no intentions of going anywhere anytime soon. Luckily for me, I was working at home for the next several days. Pretty soon, the snow really started to come down. I looked out my window occasionally, only to see more and more snow each time. It was a very heavy downfall, and soon it was nighttime. I was really glad I didn't have to go anywhere in weather like this. Occasionally, a snowplow would drive down my street, but other than that, it was completely quiet. At probably around 7 p.m., there was a sudden knock at my front door. I found this to be pretty odd. I went over and looked out the window, only to see a young woman standing outside. I didn't see a car or anything else, so I didn't know where she could have come from. At my house, from my front windows, I don't have a very good view of the street or even my driveway. I didn't know who she was, and she wasn't dressed for the weather either. She just had pants and a sweatshirt on, and appeared to be in her early 20s. I opened the door and asked her what she was doing out in weather like this. The woman asked me if she could come inside my house to warm up. Her story was that her ex-boyfriend had kicked her out of his car, then drove off or something like that. I asked her if there was anybody that could come and pick her up or something. She said she'd just called her mom and she was going to arrive soon. I didn't really like the idea of someone I knew nothing about entering my home. For some reason, I felt like it was a bad idea. I did feel bad for her with it being a snowstorm and everything though, so I allowed her to come inside in the end. I told her she could wait right inside the doorway. When you enter the front door of my house, it's kind of between the living room and the dining room. The front door is on the left side of the home, the living room is on the right, and the dining room is straight ahead. After the woman entered, she made a beeline, walking straight into the dining room. I was really confused, but I didn't say anything. I just watched her. She said something quietly, something like, "I'm sorry." 1 second later, she'd walked all the way to the back of the house and was going out of my sight. I started to move closer to her to see what she was doing. As soon as I looked around the corner, I saw her again. She was at the back door of my house, opening it up. My first thought was wondering why she was going back outside if she'd wanted to come in so badly. But that thought was interrupted when I saw the door open and 2 men suddenly walked right inside. I couldn't believe it. At that point, my instincts just kicked in. I instantly turned and ran the opposite direction. I ran towards my hallway, where my bedroom and bathroom were. I heard multiple footsteps coming after me, but they were still a ways back. After I got inside my bathroom, I closed the door and locked it. Seconds later, somebody was trying to open the door. There were multiple people outside my bathroom now. Nobody was saying anything though, including me. After the door wouldn't open, there were several loud bangs on it. I got out my phone to call the police, but I didn't feel safe staying in the bathroom. Right after dialing 911, before I had the chance to speak to the operator or anything, I tried opening my window as quickly as I could. I probably did it in record time. I jumped out my bathroom window and landed in a bush outside that was covered in snow. I then ran through the deep snow in my yard and fell several times trying to run away. I made it back to my feet quickly though, and eventually got around my house into the street. I just kept running until I made it as far away from my house as I could. Then I was finally able to talk with the 911 operator. I said everything that happened, and after that I walked down my street, far away, and waited until the police arrived. I didn't have a coat on or anything, but the craziest part is that I wasn't even cold at all. My adrenaline was going far too hard. When the police got there, the woman and the two men had already taken off. I got back to my house to find it a complete mess. There was stuff all over the floor, and a few things were stolen as well. It could have been much worse though. They didn't go in every room. They probably realized that after I got away, they would have a limited time before the police got there. I feel very lucky I made it out safely. I'm not sure what those people would have done if I had stayed. Would they have tried to hurt me? I hope not, but I'll never have to know. Since that happened, I don't answer my door to anybody I don't already know. I've also installed a Ring doorbell, which would have been nice to have at the time of the incident. I'm hoping nothing like that ever happens again. I'm a stalker. I can't say this anywhere but online anonymously. I'm a stalker and this is my story. She was coming home from work. I first caught a glimpse of her gorgeous face on the train, amongst the other commuters. Her hair was long, in a ponytail, and she had an oval face. She was so beautiful. When she got off the train, I found myself following. She left the train station and walked through a shopping center, then out onto the streets right up to her apartment. After following her for a number of days, I figured out she lived on the second floor in the 7th room, all alone. She never seemed to have noticed me. Every night she stopped off at the local convenience store and picked up a bottle of tea and some bread. Before I knew it, I found myself a stalker. I guess I knew I had a problem, but I couldn't bring myself to stop. I didn't want to do it, and I knew it was wrong, but I kept following her like this for about a month. I didn't want to do anything to her, never wanted to interact with her or touch her. I just found something so fascinating about watching her routine. She got off at the same time every night, went exactly the same route home, and I was always 1 minute behind her. I don't know what my endgame scenario was really. I guess I just liked the routine of watching her do her thing. I remember I followed her one night to her apartment and checked the time every night. I figured out she would come out her front door at 8:25 exactly. I would whisper good night every night before heading home. It was routine and there was something comforting about it. One night after I said my good night and turned around to leave, I heard footsteps behind me. At first, I didn't really pay any attention. I just went on my way home. When I started to notice the footsteps were following me in whatever direction I took, I decided to stop outside a local convenience store to take a look behind me. I was interested to see who it would be following me. I saw the figure of a woman walking toward me. It was her. She didn't regard me with a flicker of recognition. This is probably because she'd never noticed me. She probably didn't even know I existed. I was sure she was heading to the convenience store to buy something, so I headed back to the station. I had been following her routine for about a month now, so I was quite surprised by her decision to do something different that she'd never done before. I got on my train and rode it for about 30 minutes until I got to my stop. As I began walking through the dark streets, though, I heard a familiar sound behind me. Footsteps. I unlocked my door and entered my apartment, then locked it behind me again. I peeked out the window, and there she was, staring at me from just outside my door. The same thing happened the day after. I followed her to her apartment, and she did the same U-turn and followed me to mine. I had no idea what happened that caused this change in her. She decided to stalk me too. But for what reason? The more I thought about this sudden change, the less interested I was in following her routine. I started to get a bit frightened, honestly. I decided to quit following her. The next day, I got off my train and headed towards my apartment. It sounded so strange to just go home without wishing her a good night. I began to hear the familiar sound of footfalls behind me. Since that night, she followed me home every night after. At some point, she also began trying to get into my room every night. I would slowly hear the turning doorknob. At some point, she even began trying to break in as well. I'm pretty scared, no lie. I lay in bed whispering sometimes that I'm sorry I stalked her again and again, but she just won't go away. I work for a company that sells bulk products out of a small warehouse. Sometimes the products we get in are pretty expensive, so I was hired as a security guard. During the late hours of the day and most of the night, I'd be working in that small warehouse. There's not too much need to walk around the place all night though. I spend most of my time in the office, looking at a bunch of live camera feeds. During my first 3 years of working there, I'd never had one single incident. No people ever came by at strange hours, no attempted break-ins, nothing at all. In all honesty, it made for a pretty boring job and left me mostly unaware every night, even though it was basically my entire job to be aware. On this night in particular, I pulled into the small parking lot and parked by the front door. It was right next to the car of the only other worker that was still there. When I got inside, I let him know that I'd arrived, and he left shortly after. I checked all the doors and made sure all the systems were working properly, then sat back at the office and stared at the screens. My attention span died out after about half an hour, and I pulled my phone out to do some stuff. I still made sure to check on the cameras every 20 seconds or so, but every glance back at the screen showed no differences at all. Just a couple of minutes before 1 a.m. though, the system made a beep sound I'd only ever heard during the initial tests I'd do at the beginning of my shifts to make sure it's working. So this was the first time I'd actually had something come up. After a quick look at the alert, it was a motion detection of a person walking by the building. It took a few tries to find the right camera, but I did note that on the back side of the building, a man was walking right on the edge of where the parking lot met the grass. He had a thick hoodie on and was too far to see exactly what he looked like. The direction he was walking in wasn't really too anywhere though. I mean, that's why I'd never gotten alerts before, because our building is way too far out of the way for anyone to ever have a reason to walk or drive by it. I observed the man go down to the end of the parking lot, switching cameras to keep track of him. Then suddenly, he stopped for just a moment and looked back toward the building. He turned his head back and forth, looking across the whole side, then started to walk on the pavement toward the side of the building. Immediately, it went from just an odd experience to something I might have to report on. The man walked along the side looking at every door he came across, but not trying anything. He would just kind of look around, then immediately move on. Once he got to the corner, he went around to the front and then went right up to the main door. I watched from the cameras as he knocked on the door and heard it echo from inside the building. I got up from my chair and opened the office door, slowly peeking down the hallway. I could see the man standing behind the entrance doors. I don't think he could see me through the glare on the glass, so I just stood in the doorway and watched him. For a moment, he was trying to look through and continued to knock on the door again. I went back into the office and pressed on the speaker button that allowed me to talk to people outside. "This is a private location. You need to leave right now." I watched on the cameras as the man looked up at the speaker. He looked like he was going to say something, but then he frowned and returned to knocking on the door again. It was in this moment that something just gave me an intensely eerie feeling, some sort of gut reaction to this man's strange behavior. I looked closer and noticed he was keeping one hand in his pocket at all times. Maybe this man was far more dangerous than I'd initially thought. I contacted the police through our security line, getting instant connection with them and explaining the situation. I walked back into the hallway and looked down it while I talked to the dispatcher. That's when the man pulled something out of his pocket and slammed it against the door. I couldn't see what it was, but from the way it impacted and the sound it made, I knew it was some kind of metal object. He was trying to break open the glass. I rushed back into the office, hearing several more hits as I locked the heavy door behind me. I quickly looked back at the cameras, but by then the man had given up and was running away from the building. In only a few seconds, he was completely out of sight of any of the cameras. It was as I waited for the police to arrive that I replayed the footage of when the man hit the door. I could see pretty clearly that he was holding a gun and slamming the handle against the glass. We got a full report on it, but so far, even with some decent footage of the man, he hasn't been identified. We don't know what he was intending to do once he got inside. He made it obvious after hearing my voice that he didn't care I was there, but from the partial crack forming in the door, he was likely only a few hits away from shattering it, and then I would have been forced to find out the man's true intention. This is a true story, and there's proof if you decide to look it up. Anyway, let's begin. This story is about a mass murder that happened on Halloween in 2020, Quebec City in Canada. It's a very violent and graphic story, so you've been warned in advance. I'm a man, and at the time this story takes place, I was 20 years old. It was a wonderful Halloween in 2020 in Quebec. A lot of children were dressed up, people laughing, lots of happiness, everyone was having fun. It's really the only time we had some happiness and fun in that whole stupid period. Later in the evening, when it was getting really dark, a lot of people were outside. I was near the Chateau Frontenac with my dog, walking and enjoying the moment. At some point, I noticed a man wearing a cool costume. His costume was as a samurai, and he had a katana in his hand, a realistic-looking one too. I remarked to him that I thought it was a cool costume. He walked near me and gave me a look, then looked my dog over, then back at me. He told me I had a cute dog, and I replied with a simple thank you. He walked on his way, but it was quite weird. I could just feel in those few seconds that something was off. Well, about 10 minutes later, right when I was about to walk home, I was still near the same area. At some point, I heard someone yelling and crying that someone had stabbed a man with a katana. Immediately, chills began going through my body. I saw some people running, and everyone was panicking. As you can imagine, I was panicking too. Even my dog was on edge. I grabbed up my dog and we started to take off and run. As if the timing couldn't have been any more perfect, I began to hear the sounds of police sirens and see flashing lights. I was scared. I was absolutely terrified I'd run into the man again. I ran with my dog to the nearest stairwell. Now, I live all the way down the road. In Quebec, we have an up city and a down city. I was at the up city, and I actually live in the down city. We have stairs to go up and down. I went to the nearest stairs. While I was running, I saw a man sitting down with a paramedic. He had blood flowing all over his arm. It was a clean cut from a katana. As I got near the stairs, I saw another man covered with blood. He was still alive. He was also with the paramedic. There was a cop nearby too, so I was obliged to go down the road without the stairs. There were a lot of cop cars that were soaring by, and everything was so loud. I was almost home with my dog when I saw 5 cops in alert and offensive mode. They began yelling at me to get back inside. There was a maniac out on the loose. I replied that I was sorry and I lived nearby. I was just trying to get home. The police urged me to hurry up and get somewhere safe. I could understand their rushed and aggravated attitudes. I didn't take it personally. Everyone was in panic mode. As I continued onward, I finally made it home. But that's when I saw something that still traumatized me to this day. I saw one of my neighbors lying on the ground in front of her door. Right next to her was her husband. He was crying his eyes out, going hysterical. Her face was drenched in blood because her head had been half sliced open. It was a terrifying sight. I was traumatized. Later that night, the story was all over the news. They were telling all the locals to keep their doors and windows locked and secured, and that the killer was still on the loose. They didn't know if he was acting alone or if there were others also involved. Stay inside and don't go outside for any reason, at least until there was an update of the man being caught. A few hours later, he was eventually apprehended and arrested. In total, he injured 5 people and killed 2 with his katana. I really hope the 2 victims can rest in peace, and I hope this sick fuck rots away for the rest of his life in prison. The thing that really gets to me, though, is what if I didn't have my dog with me? Did he really give me a pass only because I had a cute dog? If I didn't have my dog that night, would I have been added to his list of victims? That thought gives me the chills to this very day. One thing I hate almost more than anything in this world is being waited on. I don't mean at restaurants or places like that. I mean in life in general. I've always been pretty independent, and when I first met my now husband, we didn't exactly click right away. We would literally fight over who was going to pay for the check. Fast forward to now, and we have a nice balance of things going. One thing that I usually do is take care of the house, specifically the kitchen. I cannot stand a messy kitchen and dishes in the sink. He's infamous for leaving dishes there, so that's why I take care of the kitchen when I can. Now, a few weeks ago, I had to have surgery on my knee. This past summer, I destroyed it playing softball and continued to finish the game, doing even more damage to my knee in the process. I put the surgery off for as long as I could, but the pain was just too much. It wasn't even the procedure I was anxious about, really. I actually wanted to just get it done and out of the way. I was more anxious that I was going to be bedridden for a long while. My husband is amazing, and I knew he'd take care of me, but I also knew the kitchen was going to be a mess. I'm sure this makes me sound pretty controlling, but I don't even care. I just loved making sure everything's clean. The day came, the surgery passed, and I was in bed. I was stuck. I hated it. For me, it felt like I was trapped in a cell. I was told not to move for several days, unless it was for the bathroom, and even then I should have assistance. Luckily, we had a bathroom in our bedroom, so it was only a few hops away in case I needed to go. The first night I stayed in bed and the next day I stayed at home. I was already getting restless. I hopped to the bathroom, and when I was done, I realized I was actually getting around pretty well. When my husband left for work, he begged for me to just stay in bed and said he would take care of everything when he got home. All I could think about was that the kitchen was a mess. It didn't take me long to convince myself that it would be perfectly fine to make my way there for a little while and just do the dishes real quick. I took my time on the stairs because I'll admit it was not an easy task. When I got to the bottom, I smelled something strange though. Not trash or old food that I was half expecting to smell coming from the kitchen. What I smelled was what I thought at first was some cheap cologne. I knew my husband didn't wear that though. The smell hit me harder as I took a few more steps. It wasn't cologne. What I was smelling was some sort of Axe body spray or something. I knew it right away. When I was in middle school, all the teenage boys would spray themselves with it after gym class. I'll never forget that horrible smell. I took a few more hops. I know I should have grabbed my walker, but the smell was so strong. I felt like I could almost taste it. I knew it wasn't from my husband. I would have easily smelled it on him before. I went to text him. "Hey, don't get mad, but I hobbled my way downstairs. Why does it smell like Axe body spray down here?" After I sent it, I went into the kitchen. I'll be honest, I was surprised there wasn't a mess at all. There was a small plate and fork in the sink, but other than that, he was doing a good job at keeping the kitchen in line. I went over and washed the last couple things in the sink when I noticed the back door was open. It was slightly ajar, cracked more than actually open, but it still wasn't shut all the way. Maybe this isn't that big of a deal for some people, but me and my husband rarely ever use that door. When we go out back, we usually just go out the side door. We keep that door locked at all times and put the recycling bin in front of it. I hobbled over to investigate some more. I noticed the bin outside had been moved a few inches as well. It was like the door had been opened from the outside, and the bin slid out of the way just enough to let someone in. I knew already the answer, but I texted my husband again anyway. "Hey, did you open the back door for any reason?" He didn't respond right away. I hopped back into the living room and sat down on the couch, trying to put all the pieces together and put a rational spin on everything. The thought of someone breaking in didn't even remotely cross my mind. We lived in a really nice neighborhood with almost no crime. My husband called me back a few minutes later and told me he called the police as a precaution to make sure nobody had broken in. He also said that he was heading home from work early. I got off the phone with him and sat there quietly, waiting for the police and my husband to show up. Without warning, a bang came from the closet door in the living room. It shot open, and a tall man dressed in all black ran out of the closet and out the back door. As soon as he ran by, the smell of Axe was incredibly overwhelming. I tried hopping to the window, but I was only able to get a brief glance of the man as he ran by the side of the house. I noticed he had a very thick beard, but that was pretty much it. He was out of my sight in seconds. Not long after, the police showed up, and my husband right after that. I gave them all the information I could, but like I said, I didn't really have much to give. The most disturbing part of all of this is that the cops said there were no signs of a break-in into the house, at least no signs he forced himself in. That led the police to believe that whoever this intruder was, he may have had a key to the house. My husband went out right away and bought new locks for all the doors and made sure all the windows were locked as well. No other neighbors reported anything suspicious, which makes it even more likely this person targeted our house specifically. He also did not even attempt to steal anything, which begs the question, what the hell did he want? If he wasn't swimming in Axe body spray and hadn't left that door cracked open, whatever it is he wanted, He may have gotten it,